Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any time under Committee Rule 4F. Any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chairman and the ranking minority member. I ask unanimous consent that the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters, be allowed to participate in today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. You're good now, Scott. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Good morning. I appreciate all of you being here today to discuss one of the most critical issues I believe that's facing America, and it's our outdated and cumbersome permitting process. The National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, was initially intended to promote informed decisions and assess the environmental impacts of major federal actions. Today, however, NEPA has mutated into a significant roadblock to carrying out the infrastructure and energy projects essential to America's energy and national security needs. To quote the recent Supreme Court decision on NEPA in 7-County Infrastructure Coalition versus Eagle County, Colorado, quote, 1970 legislative acorn has grown over the years into a judicial oak that has hindered infrastructure development under the guise of just a little more process, end quote. NEPA reviews have become limitless and excruciating exercises requiring agencies to amass behemoth environmental treaties, which increase project costs and create delays for projects ranging from transportation and infrastructure to forestry, conservation, and energy development. In 2020, the average length of a final environmental impact statement, or EIS, was 661 pages, and the average time to complete an EIS was a whopping 4.5 years for all projects and over 7 years for Federal Highway Administration projects. Notably, these figures do not include the time spent on pre-NEPA activities, which add even more time to the process. As a project proponent, once your behemoth NEPA document is completed, you're likely to face frivolous litigation from dark money special interest groups that have built business models around litigation to delay and block projects under NEPA. According to a recent study by the Breakthrough Institute, NEPA is the most frequently litigated environmental statute, and NEPA-related litigation takes an average of over 4 years to resolve, adding time and increasing costs and increasing uncertainty when you have a project with a federal nexus. These delays have a significant impact on projects' costs, some of which are passed along to taxpayers. In fact, an analysis by Common Good shows that a 6-year delay in construction on public projects costs the U.S. economy over $3.7 trillion. Let me repeat that. These 6-year delays on construction projects cost the U.S. economy on public projects. We're not talking about energy and other projects. We're talking about road construction and those sort of things. $3.7 trillion with no return on it to the American public. For many years, or for many projects, years of delay and increasing cost are a base case scenario. In many cases, projects are permanently halted by the courts or mired in endless reviews and appeals, prompting project proponents to simply give up. This is especially egregious given that NEPA is purely a procedural statute, a point that the Supreme Court yet again clarified in the 7-county decision. Thankfully, this case has restored some sanity in the NEPA process by limiting reviews and clarifying the lower courts should not use NEPA as a tool to block projects. While the committee was able to secure meaningful changes to NEPA and the Fiscal Responsibility Act, these changes were largely ignored by the previous administration's Council on Environmental Quality in their Phase 2 NEPA rulemaking, which also added new requirements to NEPA not found in the statute. This initiated a chain reaction that began with a lawsuit from 20 states and culminated in a court decision that vacated the Phase 2 rule, finding that the Phase 2 rule exceeded CEQ's authority under NEPA and that CEQ lacked statutory authority to promulgate any rulemaking implementing NEPA. The Trump administration's CEQ has issued guidance to agencies to follow in their respective NEPA rulemaking efforts. This guidance finally directs agencies to faithfully implement the reforms made in the FRA. While the Trump administration's actions are a positive step forward, Congress must still act to provide long-term certainty for both agencies and the regulated community. I know that some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle may try to portray efforts to amend NEPA as benefiting only a select few. However, the truth is that amending and reforming NEPA will aid all sectors of our economy, creating benefits for all Americans. We have discussed previously energy demand is skyrocketing and the AI arms race is underway. If we want to ensure a future where America remains a beacon of liberty and freedom, we must reform our permitting processes to bolster energy and national security and enhance American economic competitiveness. I look forward to hearing the testimonies from some of today's leading experts on the issue. And I also want to say that this should be a bipartisan effort. And I think it will be a bipartisan effort because I think Republicans and Democrats alike see that the process needs to be fixed, not only to get some certainty into project investment, but also to protect the environment and to achieve the goals that were put in place many Congresses ago when NEPA was passed and when the underlying statutes like ESA and MMPA and the ones that Energy and Commerce has jurisdiction over. If we really want to implement these statutes and see America grow and also see our economy and our environment thrive, then it's time to do NEPA reform. With that, I yield back and recognize Ranking Member Huffman for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I begin my statement, I'd like to, I have a unanimous consent request.
Your request?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record an article from the Wall Street Journal yesterday titled "Extreme Weather is Driving Global Food Price Spikes." As the article notes, rising food prices are the second largest effect of climate change that people see in their day-to-day lives, only exceeded by extreme heat. I do this, Mr. Chairman, and I will be doing this at every hearing we have for the rest of this Congress because we are on a reckless course under Donald Trump and this Republican majority. The policies on climate, energy, and resilience, national security cannot be normalized. We've got to stop this disastrous path that you've put us on.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So NEPA. This is a cornerstone of democracy and good governance, notwithstanding everything that you just heard. It helps ensure that major federal decisions are made transparently, with input from communities that they impact, with some understanding of the environmental health and cultural consequences of these actions. NEPA is about basic accountability. It ensures the federal government listens before it acts to a community near a new federal highway, to indigenous communities when a pipeline cuts across their lands, to the public before major land management decisions are made that affect water, wildlife, and communities for generations. NEPA requires agencies to consider the facts, disclose the consequences, and then engage the people who have to live with the results. Now, Democrats have a proven commitment to building critical infrastructure, like the transmission and clean energy that we need to address the climate crisis. We can build faster, smarter, and without sacrificing environmental safeguards. And this is where the conversation sometimes breaks down. From Congress to the courts to the Biden and Trump administrations, there's been a lot of changes to permitting in the past 2 years. Any further reforms that we contemplate should lead to concrete benefits for our climate and for clean, affordable energy, and not take us backward in ways that will have unfortunate consequences down the road. For all the American families who've been overburdened by unsafe pollution, we must use NEPA to maintain protection for health and the environment, to ensure that our air, water, and all the lands we steward under this committee's jurisdiction can provide for our children and our children's children. The good news is we can do all of these things and build things more quickly. The most effective, proven way to accelerate permitting, if that's what we really care about for infrastructure, is to ensure that we have enough experienced, knowledgeable professionals at permitting agencies. It's that simple. That's why Democrats funded $1 billion in the Inflation Reduction Act to do that, and it was working. And Mr. Chairman, I noted that you used data from 2020. We should use data from last year. The Biden administration cut the time that it takes to complete an environmental impact statement by 8 months, 23% faster than the first Trump administration. And in 2024, the median time to complete an EIS, this is for the biggest, most complex federal actions, was about 2 years. Republicans just rescinded most of the funds that helped us achieve all of that progress. On top of these cuts, Elon Musk's DOGE forced 7,500 dedicated public servants out of Interior, 15,000 out of the Department of Agriculture, thousands more from the Department of Energy, EPA, and Commerce. Many agencies have since actually, when they figured out the consequences of all these reckless cuts, tried to rehire permitting staff, realizing that it was going to affect permitting timelines, but the damage has been done. Now, this administration's proposed budget and the partisan appropriation bills currently moving through Congress would further hollow out these agencies. And that's not all. Trump and his allies are upending the rules and regulations that hold the permitting system together. They're repealing the CEQ unifying NEPA regulations, throwing out what provided a central unified playbook for navigating the review process regardless of the agencies, and we're going back to a series of piecemeal rules and regulations that will confound project developers. Rather than certainty, developers are facing more chaos. None more so than those who try to build clean energy under this administration. Some Republican colleagues in this very room used to say they were for all of the above energy, but I haven't seen them lift a finger to push back on this administration's shameless attacks on wind and solar. Last week, Interior announced that every single permit or approval for every wind and solar project that Interior touches will now require sign-off from the Secretary himself. They're also blocking wind and solar developers from using a taxpayer fund to make permitting more efficient. This is not leveling the playing field. It is adding red tape to sideline the cheapest, quickest, and cleanest sources of electricity that can power our economy. Republican attacks on these industries will jack up prices for American families and kill nearly 1 million jobs across the country by 2030. So talk about technology-neutral permitting reform is pretty meaningless, pretty empty, when all of this is happening on top of the handouts for fossil fuels in the Republicans' big, ugly bill. The only abundance that we'll see is for the big oil billionaires who profit from Republican tax breaks and land giveaways. So as we talk about permitting today, Mr. Chairman, I urge all of our colleagues to keep that context in mind, to keep one question front and center: who benefits from cutting permitting safeguards? Because right now, I promise you, it sure is not the American people. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. It's now time to begin our witness panel. Let me remind the witnesses that under committee rules, you must limit your oral statements to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will appear in the hearing record. To begin your testimony, press the on button on the microphone. We use the timing lights. When you begin, the light will turn green. When you have 1 minute left, the light will turn yellow, and when there's no time left, it will be red. I'll ask you to complete your statement. I will ask all witnesses to testify before we have member questioning. Our first witness is Mr. Tony Boals. He is the board member for the American Road and Transportation Builders Association and also serves as the vice president of the Wright Brothers Construction Company in Charleston, Tennessee. Mr. Boals, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Westerman, Chairman Westerman, Ranking Member Huffman, and committee members, thank you for the opportunity to testify here today on behalf of the American Road and Transportation Builders Association. I'm Tony Boals with Wright Brothers Construction Company, a heavy civil highway contractor based in Charleston, Tennessee. And I'm here to affirm that environmental stewardship and infrastructure improvements, when done correctly, can reinforce each other. Projects that reduce congestion, protect natural resources, and enhance mobility can coexist with responsible environmental oversight. At Wright Brothers, we train our employees on proper stormwater management, erosion prevention, and sediment control specific to the areas in which they're working. We undertake projects to benefit the community, like a recent effort in Bradley County, Tennessee, to convert a former cattle farm into a thriving wetland. We're joined by many in our industry in this commitment to environmental stewardship. The National Environmental Policy Act was created as a procedural tool to promote harmony between development and the environment. And we support this mission and appreciate the committee's review of NEPA. Before a few process reforms on improving NEPA for all parties, I'd like to share how permitting plays a role in our business. There's no doubt that the permitting process for transportation projects is complex. In addition to NEPA, transportation projects may require separate permits under laws such as Endangered Species Act, Clean Water Act, or the Clean Air Act, just to name a few. These permits can take time, and with that time comes uncertainty about potential delays in the approval process and the looming threat of litigation. These risks translate into increased costs for transportation improvement, which in turn dilutes limited public sector resources. Recent actions by Congress to reform NEPA in 2021's Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and in 2023's Fiscal Responsibility Act demonstrates bipartisan appetite to improve this important statute. Just like we are constantly adapting our business to reflect our changing world, the regulatory structure can always be improved. And in that spirit, we would like to offer these 3 recommendations. First, more states should take on NEPA responsibilities. 8 states, red, blue, urban, and rural, have taken on NEPA assignment. They report millions in annual cost savings while shaving months off the environmental review process. To compel more states to take on NEPA responsibilities, ARPA recommends standardizing the approval process, making NEPA assignments permanent after an initial audit, and offering additional federal resources to help states cover the associated cost. Second, one federal decision must be properly enforced to ensure lead agencies meet the required timelines and page limitations. Despite bipartisan action codifying one federal decision, the time it takes to complete an environmental impact statement remains double the intended 2-year target. And typically on much larger projects and complex projects, that time is often longer. Standardizing required documents, limiting lawsuits that occur after agency action, and expanding one federal decision to environmental assessments would make this reform more effective. Third, the federal funding threshold for categorical exclusion should be increased to $10 million to reflect the post-pandemic increase in construction cost. With thoughtful, targeted reforms, Congress won't just improve timelines, they will improve outcomes and help deliver transportation enhancements that communities need. We look forward to working with you to enact NEPA improvements that will allow our companies to deliver safer roads, smoother commutes, and more efficient freight network, all while protecting the environment. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Boals, thank you for your testimony. Our next witness is Mr. Tony Campbell. He is the CEO of the East Kentucky Power Cooperative, and he's located in Winchester, Kentucky. Mr. Campbell, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Westerman, Ranking Member Huffman, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Tony Campbell, and I'm President and CEO of East Kentucky Power Cooperative. EKPC and our owner power the lives of over 1 million Kentucky residents. I appreciate the opportunity to testify on behalf of both East Kentucky Power Cooperative and the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, which represents 900 electric cooperatives across America and serves 42 million Americans. For the nation's electric industry, Winter Storm Uri in 2021 was a wake-up call. Nearly 250 Texas residents died because widespread power outages in the state caused an extreme in weather. EKPC is working hard to ensure that does not happen in Kentucky. We are planning, building, and maintaining the power plants and power lines to keep electricity flowing. Our generating resources include coal, natural gas, hydro, solar, and landfill gas. However, we need more, and a lot more generation. Normal day-to-day electric consumption is growing in Kentucky, as is peak consumption. In the past 4 winters, we've set new peaks demand records. Our peak loads have grown nearly 25% in 3 years, and our total energy load is projected to grow another 25% over the next 15 years. This is significant load growth, and it's driven by the following: widespread U.S. electrification, industrial growth of existing industrial customers, onshoring of new manufacturing, an unprecedented rise in power-intense hyperscaler facilities and data centers. To keep up, EKPC is currently investing $3 billion in new and upgraded power plants and power lines. EKPC is protecting reliable power plants and building new resources. We're replacing aging power lines and building brand new transmission infrastructure. Projects like these are exposed to tremendous risk by today's permitting process. NEPA was designed to ensure environmental stewardship, but in practice, it is often used to delay or derail critical infrastructure projects. If our projects are stalled, we risk inadequate generation capacity during peak events, especially during winter or summer extremes when the end consumer needs electricity the most. The lesson of 2021's Winter Storm Uri in Texas means pain and suffering, or worse, for some of the most vulnerable members of our society. We also risk falling behind in supporting new manufacturing facilities or data centers. If the reliable power isn't there, investments and jobs will go elsewhere. Routine maintenance and vegetation management may also experience NEPA delays. Projects that require federal permits, right-of-ways, and other approvals are subject to environmental reviews, which are often redundant. Congress has an opportunity to ensure NEPA will no longer be used to paralyze projects or serve as a roadblock to needed energy transmission and broadband infrastructure. The administration recently announced some streamlined permitting processes that build on the good work Congress has done. To continue this progress, we offer these recommendations. First, Congress should identify solutions to reduce unnecessary litigation delays, setting reasonable timelines for lawsuits and requiring challengers to have participated in the public comment process. Second, Congress should reinforce that NEPA is meant to ensure informed decisions, not favor or discredit specific energy sources. Environmental reviews must also remain focused on direct, foreseeable impacts within an agency's authority, not speculative and unrelated downstream effects. In conclusion, the U.S. is starving for predictable and efficient permitting to maintain electric reliability and meet growing demand. Cooperatives across this nation and EKPC are ready and able to deliver, but we need efficient, predictable regulatory to do so. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Mr. Campbell, thank you for your testimony. I ask unanimous consent to submit to the record a study from the Center for Growth and Opportunity. This is a 2022 analysis showing that out of 136 NEPA EISs finalized in 2020, the average preparation time was 4.8 years. I think this is the outdated information my colleague referred to. Without objection, so ordered. Also ask unanimous consent to submit for the record a January 2025 analysis from the Bipartisan Policy Center, noting that CEQ's own findings showed that just 39% of environmental impact statements completed since the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023 met the required 2-year deadline. And I will note that before the FRA, this report shows that 29% of projects were under 2 years, and it shifted to 39%, which is an improvement, but it doesn't address the major problem that we have with these project delays. 61% of the projects still failed to comply. Without objection, so ordered. Our next witness is Mr. Andrew Mergen. He is the Faculty Director of Emmett Visiting Assistant Clinical Professor of Law at the Emmett Environmental Law and Policy Clinic of the Harvard Law School. That's a mouthful. And is stationed in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Mr. Mergen, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Westerman, Ranking Member Huffman, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me today. Prior to joining the faculty at Harvard Law School, I spent over 30 years litigating NEPA cases, among others, at the U.S. Department of Justice. And prior to that, I worked for the Bureau of Land Management in Lander, Wyoming, where I gained some exposure as to how NEPA requirements were met by land managers in the Bureau. I have a lot of experience with NEPA, and I have some good projects, seen good projects mired in litigation. I have also read NEPA documents that were overly long, NEPA documents that were repetitive and overly long. But notwithstanding this experience, I'm not cynical or skeptical about this statute. To the contrary, despite its problems, there is a reason that this statute is widely emulated by state governments, foreign governments, and international lenders like the World Bank. This is a look before you leap statute. Looking before you leap makes a lot of sense. All rational decision makers want to make informed decisions, and disclosing information to the public and giving the public an opportunity to weigh in is a fundamental part of the American project and experience. This morning, I want to focus on 3 quick points. First, I want to address some myths about NEPA that sometimes cloud our judgment about the statute. Second, I want to say a word about the current landscape. And finally, while there is great cause for optimism, there are significant headwinds brewing that Congress can address in oversight. First, myths. The first myth is that permitting is NEPA alone. Permitting is complex. There are permitting delays even where there is no federal nexus. And NEPA is a procedural statute, but other statutes like the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, Endangered Species Act are substantive. Projects can falter when they run afoul of these substantive statutes, but NEPA often gets undeserved blame. Also, NEPA is more than the big infrastructure EISs. Projects under CEs and environmental assessments proceed apace, and the bulk of NEPA decisions can and do proceed efficiently. There's a myth that the public participates only to grind things to a halt. This is not true. A recent study by Arizona researchers shows that public participation significantly changes projects for the better. This confirms what many of us have long known, that the public improves NEPA decision-making. Myth 4, litigation. There's a myth that litigation grinds projects to a halt. That can be true, but mostly it is not. And we can expect that landscape to change as a result of changes in the legal landscape in the last 2 years. The Fiscal Responsibility Act in 2023 and H.R. 1 both include provisions intended to speed up NEPA process. These are significant changes and should be allowed to take effect before Congress enacts additional reforms. This is especially true after the 7-county case. That decision does 3 things. It gives additional deference to the agency and that narrows judicial review. Justice Kavanaugh says, writing for the majority, that it's a decision about deference. That's important. It limits the scope of analysis by focusing on the proposed project, and it states that courts need not enjoin every violation of NEPA. This has largely been the law, but this endorsement is likely to curtail injunctions. Notwithstanding this good news, right, for project proponents, there are significant headwinds. First and foremost is reductions in force. NEPA delays are related to capacity. The deference that Justice Kavanaugh identifies in the opinion is deference to the agency. And deference to the agency depends on agencies showing their work and expertise. Agency cuts call that into question. Confusion. CEQ has disclaimed any role in centralizing the regulatory regime. Agencies are proceeding in a hodgepodge fashion. Some are doing regulations, some are doing guidelines, because as we all know, project proposals often require multiple agency approvals. This is a recipe for friction and inefficiency. Public participation. Efforts to cut the public out of the process, most notably by the Department of Interior, increase litigation risk. The statute and case law require meaningful participation. Interior's efforts will increase litigation. This is also just short-sighted. The public has relevant info, the public can improve projects, and the public should be allowed to participate meaningfully. These headwinds can be addressed in oversight. Congress should demand order and regularity from the agencies. Demanding order will increase efficiency. I welcome your questions.
Mr. Mergen, thank you for your testimony. Our final witness is Mr. Alex Herrgott. He is the president and CEO of the Permitting Institute, and he is stationed in Washington, D.C. Mr. Herrgott, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman and members of the committee. After 15 years of leading the permitting reform from inside the Senate Environment and Public Works, before my time at CEQ in the White House, I now lead the Permitting Institute, a national nonpartisan pro-development trade association representing project sponsors, former agency officials, and permitting practitioners across all sectors of American infrastructure. I don't come at this from theory. In fact, with CEQ, we delivered some of the largest wind and solar projects this country has ever seen, collectively twice as many as the Biden and Obama presidencies combined. Permitting isn't failing because agencies say no. It's failing because no one is empowered or protected enough to say yes. What started as a framework of accountability has become a blueprint for paralysis. When it comes to the fact that every project that turns dirt requires a balance between the natural environment and human activity, and we're unable to come together to decide that the phones that we use, the cars that we use require energy, but prevent the process that actually gets us to the place that we need to be, we're starting to lose our minds. For most major projects, sponsors now spend $25 to $50 million just to prepare for environmental review. That's not construction, it's permitting survival, and that delay begins long before the public ever sees it. We need to look at the first step, which happens years before the notice of intent is published in the Federal Register. This phase, which I call bureaucratic limbo, is among the most damaging and least visible parts of the system that nobody talks about. The starting point is no longer an application in the NEPA Germany. It's no longer the baseline. It's a launch pad jammed with procedural debris. What used to take 3 to 6 months post-application now routinely takes 6 to 3 years, not taking into account any timeline. Or it simply never begins. In this undocumented front end, developers often find themselves simulating full EISs just to be allowed to initiate one. It's a form of anticipatory overbuild, an expensive, time-consuming exercise in preemptive appeasement driven by unspoken agency expectations and the fear of being told their application is not complete and not having anything to do about it. There's no dashboard, no timeline, no CEQ oversight, no public record. For every one project that moves forward to just get posted in the Federal Register, 20 die on the vine. That's why the Permitting Institute speaks, because someone has to speak for the investor, cut through the noise, and speak for the projects that suffer in silence. We're not evaluating real impacts in the environmental review process anymore. We're modeling light reflection at dusk. We're simulating insect mating acoustics in ecosystems no one is regulating. We're forecasting global fertilizer impacts from domestic hydrogen hubs in South America. These are not rhetorical hypotheticals. These are real NEPA reviews and lawsuits produced not to improve project outcomes, but to stretch the review process until the capital dries up, and when it does, consensus erodes. Because it doesn't matter whether the project's a clean or conventional or public or private or rural or urban, if the permitting process itself becomes unworkable, then infrastructure becomes unbuildable. The system no longer selects for merit or environmental benefit, it selects for endurance. The pendulum has swung beyond energy source and policy preference. The kitchen sink attack model, where every conceivable theory is thrown at the wall to delay or remand, is now normalized against all sectors. Then came the CEQ report. In this January, President Biden's CEQ published a 2.2-year permitting timeline. I know what they did. I worked at CEQ, and let's be honest. What CEQ published wasn't a performance report. It was a political message. It was a manufactured result based on cherry-picked samples, redefined timelines, and the exclusion of the very delays that consume the most time and money. I don't know anyone that got an authorization to construct off an final environmental impact statement. Not counting the record of decision is statistical malpractice. There was no statutory requirement to publish that number. It was a choice, and it made things worse. It saps momentum, and it weakens reformers. It undercuts credibility with investors, auditors, and oversight bodies who still have to explain why a 2.2-year system is still taking 5 years for their project. If permitting had worked, we'd be attending IRA groundbreakings, not clawbacks and extensions. And let me be clear, this is not ideological, it's operational. I didn't imagine these breakdowns. I've watched them happen across sectors and agencies and administrations. By codifying reasonably foreseeable effects in the FRA without defining its scope, Congress opened the door and creative opponents were all too eager to walk in. That single omission now governs the future permitting in this country, allowing litigation to be built on facts, not on facts, but on imagination. Until Congress closes that door with statutory clarity, the system will remain vulnerable to ever-expanding theories of downstream harm, indirect displacement, and speculative ripple effects that no agency is designed to adjudicate. If this body wants permitting to mean something again, it must start by finishing the job the FRA left undone. We don't need to choose between environmental protection and economic progress, but we do need to choose whether the permitting system will continue to serve delay or begin to serve the public. The status quo is unsustainable. Let's be honest. And if we're honest with ourselves, that we can't build anything and that the impacts are affecting all sectors and that politics have nothing to do with the fact that the system is broken, then we can act accordingly. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Herrgott, thank you for your testimony. Thank you to all the witnesses for your testimony. I've found things I agree with in every witness's testimony. And Mr. Mergen, even though I prefer Yale Blue over Crimson Harvard, I still think you made some good points in your testimony. Before we get to questions, going to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record this 3,600-page EIS from the Surface Transportation Board that considered the impacts of constructing an 88-mile rail line connecting the Uinta Basin to the National Rail Network. This behemoth of a document ultimately culminated in the Supreme Court case decided this spring, the 7-County Infrastructure Coalition versus Eagle County. And a point I want to make is ask yourself how many of your neighbors, constituents, or community members would find time in their busy life to sit down and read 3,600 pages of environmental review jargon. It takes the average adult reads about 50 pages an hour. That means it would take a person 9 full business days of doing nothing else but reading to get through the entire documents from end to end. The length of these documents acts as a barrier to public participation. It also delays projects, increases litigation hooks, and harms the environment by delaying projects that provide environmental benefits. Without objection, so ordered.
And Mr. Chairman, in the same note, I guess I would like to ask unanimous consent to enter the FRA amendments that are now current law, providing great news in response to your point. Under law, EISs are now limited to 150 pages. So we don't need to worry about that anymore. With unanimous consent, I'd like to enter that in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you.
So ordered. We'll now recognize members for questions. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been pointed out that everything in our lives that makes them possible, let alone comfortable, everything in this room, is either mined or it's grown. There's no other way to produce it. And yet NEPA strikes at the very heart of this fundamental and foundational activity that supports human population. Now, the ranking member posed the question, who benefits from NEPA reform? Mr. Herrgott, let me put that question to you. Who would benefit from NEPA reform?
Everybody. In particular, those projects that were funded from the IRA that are trying to beat the timeline. On an order of magnitude of 5 to 1, right now the capital investment is in non-fossil fuel projects. The idea that permitting is supported and championed by Republicans and not Democrats has always perplexed me.
Mr. Boals, what are your thoughts? Who benefits from NEPA reform?
Those that would benefit from NEPA reform would be the general public, the general taxpayers to, pardon?
Essentially, everyone who uses anything that is mined or grown. Am I correct?
Correct.
Mr. Herrgott, let me put the opposite question to you. Who benefits from the status quo?
Nobody wins under the status quo. Nobody.
Oh, I disagree with you completely on that. I think there's an entire industry of litigants and environmental charlatans who are making out like bandits under our current process. Am I missing something?
No, you're absolutely not. In fact, if I was going into a career now, I would be an engineer and environmental consultant, because now with environmental reviews that have grown by 400% page number, even though they might be 150 pages, there's another 2,000 of appendices with modeling that hasn't even really been existed yet, with AI, with hyper-intensive 3D seismic studies that aren't even required by law that are now being done for overbuild. That is a great career to be in because we don't see that reducing anytime soon.
Mr. Boals, who do you think is benefiting from the status quo?
That would be hard to answer, to go through the minutia of all the approval process. There's much to be done or can be done to streamline the process so that all benefit. Right now, I think it's the people who charge by the hour to review the permit.
And how much do they charge by the hour? I've seen some environmental attorneys are being awarded $750 an hour out of taxpayer funds to produce and litigate all of this stuff.
I couldn't speak to that, but if that's the case, I may be in the wrong industry.
You know, I represent the Sierra Nevada and the Central Valley of California, so I spend a great deal of my time on this committee over the years dealing with fire and water issues. And what constantly comes back to me is that they all draw their problems from NEPA. Our water projects have been brought to a complete halt. The example I like to use is the Sugar Pine Reservoir, a little reservoir that serves a tiny community in Placer County. They needed to install a spillway gate to increase the water capacity of the Sugar Pine Reservoir. $2 million for that spillway gate. That's a heavy lift for that little community, but within reach. But on top of that, they then had to budget $9 million for environmental studies and environmental mitigations, which made that $2 million project an $11 million boondoggle. Graham Kent, who runs Alert Tahoe, they place the early warning cameras throughout the Sierra to spot fires so that they can be put out before they spread. And protect the forest environment. He said that the single greatest impediment he has to placing those cameras to protect our forest environment is the National Environmental Policy Act. This committee for years has documented damage done by NEPA to forest management, adding millions of dollars of costs, literally years of average delay in forest thinning projects. The damage that has been done is absolutely incredible. Since these laws were enacted to protect the forest environment, we've seen an 80% decline in timber harvested off of the federal lands and a concomitant increase in acres destroyed by fire. Randy Moore, the chief of the Forest Service under Biden, sat right there and admitted to this committee that in just the last 10 years, we have lost 27% of our national forest to catastrophic fire because these laws have caused them to become catastrophically, morbidly overgrown because we can no longer practice the forest management projects that had preserved these forests for a century when we allowed the Forest Service to actually do so. I'll yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Maine, Mr. Golden, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'm going to yield time to the ranking member. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. So one of the most confusing, if not just nakedly hypocritical things we hear in this conversation is that our friends across the aisle care deeply about business certainty. And I just want to remind folks that there is no certainty in Donald Trump's America. We are seeing an agenda that is taking away health care from millions and millions of Americans, whipsawing tariffs on again, off again. No one has any idea what our trade policy is day to day. One day we are in an existential war about artificial intelligence with China. The next day we're selling AI semiconductor chips to China. ICE offices one day are told, don't go into farms, don't go into restaurants, we're going to give that industry a break. The next day, they're doing raids in those very same places. So it's a little bit rich when we hear high sanctimony from across the aisle about the importance of certainty. What we have been getting is a lot of chaos. And in this space of environmental review, it's especially chaotic because on his first day in office, Donald Trump actually repealed the decades-old executive order that gave CEQ authority to reduce chaos by having a unified, consistent set of NEPA regulations for every federal agency. We finally got to that point, that holy grail of one set of rules so developers don't have to navigate a regulatory maze, and Donald Trump repealed it. So we now have a bureaucratic free-for-all. Different rules, different standards from one agency to another. The few remaining agency staff that are left after all these chaotic reductions in force are applying different rules to the same person for the same project. So Mr. Mergen, you have spent years defending the federal government in NEPA-related litigation. Given what we know, do you think this uncertainty is going to bring us more litigation or less?
I think that this uncertainty is going to bring us more litigation and less prosperity and growth over the near term. I spent 30 years working side by side, lawyers from private practice, defending mines, pipeline projects, oil and gas leasing decisions. I know that community quite well. And I can say with some assurance that that community is really unsettled by what is happening at CEQ, what is happening to the executive branch. We've moved away from a regulatory system that has long been in place and provided some security to a free-for-all, where different agencies in the same remit, like FERC and DOE, are proceeding under a different NEPA regime. Some agencies are doing guidelines. Some agencies are doing regulations. This is an invitation to chaos, to confusion, and to litigation. What we all need to move forward with meaningful infrastructure improvements is stability in the NEPA framework, and we are losing that. And I really want to underscore, Mr. Huffman, your point about agency capacity. I worked side by side people in the Bureau of Land Management, throughout Interior, on oil and gas leasing, on offshore leasing, tremendous expertise, really, really fine civil servants, dedicated to public service. Those folks are gone. They have left. And we cannot build better. We cannot build infrastructure. We cannot manage our resources in an effective way without an effective civil service. And that civil service will be able to achieve the harmony that the witnesses have talked about today, which I wholeheartedly agree is obtainable, right? We can grow and we can take care of the environment, but it requires capacity, it requires expertise, and it requires regulatory certainty.
Thank you. Mr. Herrgott, in his testimony, spent a lot of time talking about this period before the official NEPA clock sounds. Sort of this regulatory limbo he describes, this valley of death for projects where huge costs are incurred, studies are done, all of this stuff that doesn't even count in the NEPA review period. I've been involved in some big projects. We call that due diligence, to make sure that a project even makes sense before you officially move forward with it. What's your experience been for that pre-NEPA period?
The amount of money that is being spent on
The question's for Mr. Mergen.
I apologize.
Yeah, so I would just say, I'm confused by that dichotomy because I do think it's due diligence. I think when you develop a project, you're looking at everything. You're looking at how is the community going to be affected? Where am I going to find support? Where can I build jobs for those communities?
So we shouldn't blame NEPA for the fact that anyone who is a thinking person does due diligence before building.
Correct. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. LaMalfa, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the hearing today on this important topic, and it's cracking me up once again, the idea that Donald Trump, after 50-plus years of layers of first the legislation that put some of these in place, and then many lawsuits on top of that, different interpretations, and a bureaucracy that has only grown in slowness and in size. Somehow that is blamed currently on President Trump. I mean, Mr. Chairman, I really enjoy that graphic you got there, that poster there, which, you know, the flow chart for making a natural gas pipeline project. And it's hard to read the font on the 8x14 here, and it's hard to read the font there. And it's actually, it'd be kind of hard to dunk over that thing. It's so tall. It's given the amount of steps you would have to take. So appreciate that illustration. And as noted earlier by one of our colleagues, is that they're celebrating now that it's down to 150 pages over a period of time. Well, that took probably one of those earth-ending bills and pieces of legislation that might have come from this committee to shorten that stack of pages of timeline in order to get these done. So indeed, the NEPA process, although well-intentioned 50-plus years ago, is now a giant roadblock and way of getting important things done. My colleague from California talked about forest management a little bit there, and you know, to do a simple thing like maintaining one of the forest roads, to replace a culvert, to do just minimal amounts of work, you got to get a NEPA. Got to do the environmental before you can do simple things that help keep our forests in a place where we can manage them. So. And then we have the remedy being like, well, we just need more money and more staff and more personnel that are really good experts on this. So we had the laughably named Inflation Reduction Act a couple years ago, which is tagged at anywhere between $1 and $2 trillion, depending how it plays out over the years. money had to come from thin air. And so some of that money supposedly was getting to helping with staff up the bureaucracies so they would get through these timelines, get through these permits quicker. So we had a hearing with Forest Service a couple years ago on that, and they said, oh, we've had more money right now available than we ever had before. Yet, in the same sense, they said, we need $30 million more in order to approve a project that would require some, or that would make some important thinning and forest management available over in another state. So one thing after another, it isn't going to be adding bureaucrats to the equation. It's going to be getting them focused on a narrow timeline of what NEPA really should be, and not every case really needs NEPA. We need more categorical exclusions and things to get things done, certainly to help save our forests and the ravages of fire year after year. So, Mr. Herrgott, let me ask you a little bit about that. So with the categorical exclusions in forested areas around the power lines, making fuel breaks so we can save our towns instead of burning down, like I've had 3 of my towns burned down, around critical infrastructure. What do you see as we can do to advance that cause, to have categorical exclusions be not these scary things that are trying to bypass NEPA, but actually useful towards getting projects done?
I think one of the more important things, and it's simple, and it's something this committee could tackle easily, because at the end of the day, I'm trying to fix a problem, not prove a point, is we don't have transparency. If you walk in Department of Interior right now, it doesn't matter if it was Secretary Haaland or if it was Secretary Burgum, and you ask how many EISs, how many categorical exclusions, how many environmental assessments, FONSIs, all the relevant aspects of NEPA, it would take weeks to get back, because it's not centrally tracked. It's nearly impossible to figure out where it is in the system. Categorical exclusions, even on the forest side, that used to take anywhere between 3 months to 6 months, are taking 2 years and overbuild. And you better hope they don't have an interagency dependency with another, with the Fish and Wildlife Service or with the Bureau of Reclamation, because at that point, your categorical exclusion ends up becoming a built-out EA dressed up as reform.
Yeah, 2 or 3 fire seasons can go by in that kind of review time.
Oh, exactly, exactly.
We had a project suffer in Butte County, my home county, where they had the dollars lined up to do some work, and then waiting so long for the permits, the place burned down instead. Let's talk a little about, we hear a lot of pie in the sky about electrifying so many more things on our grid, you know, our automobiles, trucks, appliances, yard devices, yet important minerals like copper. It takes, in one case, 29 years to get a copper mine permitted, typically more like maybe 12 or so. How is that going to help us electrify the whole grid like some wish to do?
It's absolutely not. And the thing about permitting and the permitting system in particular is we got to remove the obstacles and the headwinds for all sectors, right? Do it for mining, do it for transmission, do it for offshore wind. Just remove obstacles. And at the end of the day, the mining sector runs on such low margins, we are never going to win an asymmetric war with China if we continue to add 20 to 30% just on the permitting cost. Every dollar that goes towards a mine development, right out the door, with no environmental gain to cultural historic resources.
Yeah, thank you. I misspoke on the grid. The grid will be overloaded by electrifying everything that is required to be on the grid. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield back.
Gentlemen's time's expired. Mr. McClintock, you're
I'd
recognized.
ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a smoky wire post titled, "Let's Review Some Forest Service NEPA Stats from January of this year." It gives examples of critical projects that were delayed or blocked due to the lengthy NEPA process. It includes a story of Grizzly Flat in my district, the town that was completely wiped out by the Caldor fire because of the trestle project had been delayed for over a decade that would have protected that town. Mr. Mergen might want to visit the ruins someday and reevaluate his policies. I submit that for the record.
Without objection. So ordered. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Randall, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. You know, as I have spoken about before, tribes in my district are co-stewards of forests, rivers, and shores, not just as public stewards, but as sovereign nations with enduring legal responsibilities and sacred relationships to these lands. And I am concerned that sweeping changes that we are seeing to permitting regulations and agency staffing will undermine our ability to uphold our treaty and trust responsibility to the tribal nations, not just in the 6th Congressional District of Washington, but across the country. You know, the recent approval of uranium mines in Utah in just 11 days highlights a serious concern compressing what should have been months of environmental review into mere days, and granting tribal governments only 7 days to assess the impacts on their ancestral lands. Such fast-tracked steamroller approaches compromise the very principle of permitting and environmental assessment. It undermines tribal sovereignty and risks even further environmental injustices. Even prior to the changes that the Trump administration made, we heard concerns from coastal tribes in Washington about the lack of appropriate consultation during the permitting process. And the Trump administration is taking a broad approach to limit tribal consultation, and I'm concerned that they will make an already imperfect process worse. I have, we've referenced Interior's memo on the emergency process for NHPA, the emergency provisions under the National Historic Preservation Act, the primary statute that tribes can use to advocate for the protections. Under these procedures of Section 106 compliance, to be considered in compliance eligible project sponsors only have to sign a form affirming that they will implement measures to avoid or minimize harm to historic properties or sacred sites to the extent prudent and feasible. Mr. Mergen, based on your knowledge of the permitting process, will this adequately protect tribal sacred sites and other historic places as the administration considers new offshore and onshore energy projects?
No, I think that I want to talk a little bit about the alternative arrangements process that Interior has adopted. And I want to say that this is an incredible departure from past practice. CEQ has always recognized that processes could and should be expedited for emergencies like forest fires, for emergencies in the wake of disasters like Hurricane Katrina and the like. And so there's always been a regulatory process for accelerated reviews. The departure from the invocation of this process by the administration, by the Department of the Interior right now, is a radical departure, which is completely disregards longstanding commitments and responsibilities to the native nations, sovereign nations of the United States. And it is profoundly troubling. And I would note, and we've talked a lot about fire today, and I think that's really important. And I agree with the work that has been done in terms of creating categorical exclusions and the like to manage fire risk. But to cut out the native peoples of North America, the indigenous people, when you're assessing these sorts of projects is a huge mistake. Indigenous folks of North America understood the importance of fire management long before a lot of American foresters, including Aldo Leopold, got the big picture. And this disregard and cutting out of the public is not just inconsistent with the statute and longstanding case law, but it is also just not sensible in terms of the important input we're losing.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Mergen. And, I only have a few seconds remaining, but want to underscore that there might also be significant barriers to tribal historic preservation officers and Indian tribes submitting their comments in the much shortened time period. We're talking about 7 days of notification for a project. Do you anticipate challenges and barriers there?
Yeah, huge. I mean, the one thing I think that the members in the committee should keep in mind is that we have made substantial progress in the administration of NEPA. It may not be perfect at this moment, but there has been progress and there's further progress being made. And one of the areas where we made a lot of progress and we're losing that progress is with the sovereign nations of the United States, sovereign Indian nations. Tribal historic preservation officers, the engagement of the tribes in the management of their resources, their sacred sites that are important to all Americans. There is wide bipartisan support for the preservation of religious freedoms of Native Americans, right? and for the preservation of their sacred places and sites. We are losing the expertise that we need to manage that. And the tribes have always been having to play catch up because of lack of resources, because of lack of expertise. And now we are losing the people at the Department of the Interior with the most expertise and most knowledge about these issues. And we are losing the funds that allow the tribes
Mr. Mergen.
to become meaningful participants. I'll stop. Thank you, sir.
I usually try to give grace when a witness is answering a question and the clock expires, but we've got to keep some order here. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Bentz, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you witnesses for being here today. Mr. Campbell, I had the good fortune to represent as an attorney for a period of time Idaho Power Company. It was engaged in trying to relicense its privately held dams on the Snake River. Not the four you generally hear about environmentalists trying to remove on the lower reaches of that river. And that process has taken something like 20 years. If everyone saw the intersection of policy arguments with trying to get something done in that space, that's it. Although I think that's kind of what you guys are all hinting at here, that we have the fight that goes on in court and the fight that goes on in the hearings. All of this seems to be a mixture of policymaking combined with trying to actually build something. I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out exactly where best to attack this problem, but my question to you is this. You say in your testimony that we are facing a crisis of shortage of electricity. I've heard it over and over and over again, driven in significant part by artificial intelligence. We see that China is dramatically ahead of us when it comes to electrical generation. Something like 86 gigawatts of coal created this year or within the last year in China. Where are we now? Well, we're still fighting through these kinds of mixtures of policy, debate versus building something. My question to you is, what would you suggest that we do first in this space? I don't expect a magic bullet, but I want to know, what is it that we should focus on, in your opinion, to try to get out of the quagmire that we have created? And as an attorney, I understand it better than most, but give us your best shot at what we should do.
So you're absolutely correct, and we need power in this country. And I've never seen load growth like we're seeing right now, and data centers are a big driver. They're the hyperscalers. We have one in our territory that's load that I've never even dreamed of that we would have. I think we have to serve that load, and I think data centers and AI, we have to win this battle. We can't lose this to China, and that is we need to build generation. And in my opinion, with the NEPA process, we're not suggesting do away with it. We all want to be good stewards of the environment. However, we think there needs to be time limits. Let's have time limits on the litigation. Let's have time limits on all the agencies getting information done, because we need projects and we need them yesterday. We're already behind in this country, and without the ability to move quickly, we're going to be in trouble in this country. I see a catastrophic event happening in the future.
No, we had a situation in Oregon where land use planning had stalled out the construction of prisons. And suddenly we were overwhelmed by the challenge of finding a place to put people who had committed crimes, no place to house them. So the permitting process was set aside and the prisons were built. Is that what you're suggesting should happen here?
Could you repeat that question
Yeah,
one more time?
so what happened, we set aside the process in Oregon because there was no way we were going to get a prison built the next 10 to 15 years. So the process went to the side, the prison got built. Is that what you're suggesting we should do in this electrical space, this generation space?
I'm sorry. I'm not suggesting do away with the process. I'm saying modify the process so you have an end date, right? I mean, what you don't want to do, in my personal opinion, is find certain things that you're going to circumvent doing everything, because we all want to protect the environment. But they need a limit, right? So you can build that prison when you need that prison, not let people pervert the process.
Thank you. I appreciate that and your thoughts. I want to go to Mr. Herrgott for just a moment. Section 7 of the ESA is being perverted and used as an extortionary device to force people who are trying to get permits or get through these processes to pay exorbitant sums of money to state agencies, which they can then use in any way they like, and they just basically have to buy their way around the process in that fashion, right? Because they're setting the process aside and just saying, give us a bunch of money, we'll use it to offset whatever damage you're doing. Is that the solution?
Mitigation can work in many situations, but the reality is that a project developer in that situation, a Habitat, has to get everything right and has to take care of all scenarios. And to take a project down, you only need to prevail on one theory and one thing at all. And because this is a risk-based standard, and so there are discretionary decisions being made about objective laws. And when you have a situation like that that is based on real people making subjective decisions based on what they think and what they feel, afraid of what they're going to be sued on, then you do not get an informed permitting process. You get overbilled and you get fear-based decision-making.
Thank you. Yield back.
The chair now recognizes Representative Rivas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for recognizing me. Mr. Mergen, can you confirm that Section 60026 of the Republicans' One Big Ugly Bill allows project sponsors to pay a fee to expedite their project's environmental analysis and environmental impact studies?
Yes, that's correct.
Mr. Mergen, can you confirm that Section 50101 of the Republicans' One Big Ugly Bill resumes non-competitive leasing and mandatory quarterly lease sales for onshore oil and gas drilling?
That's correct.
Mr. Mergen, can you confirm that Section 50102 of the Republicans' One Big Ugly Bill mandates 2 offshore lease sales off the Gulf of Mexico every year until 2039?
Yes, that's correct.
Mr. Mergen, can you confirm that Section 50201 of the Republicans' One Big Ugly Bill removes the Department of Interior's discretion in coal leasing and mandates that the lease be granted?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you for confirming these facts. It's deeply unsettling to see how President Trump and his House Republicans are attacking our climate and our communities. Can you talk about the harmful impacts that the One Big Ugly Bill will have on working class communities like mine in the San Fernando Valley of Los Angeles that have carried the environmental burden for decades?
Yeah, I think it's, oh, sorry. Yes, thank you. I think one of the great advantages of the NEPA process, right, is the public engagement and the ability to hear from communities about how they may be impacted by oil and gas leasing or oil and gas refining. And we know that there are substantial health effects to children, to people, as a result of those sorts of developments. And so the NEPA process and that is engaged in oil and gas leasing and coal leasing in the development of fossil fuels is profoundly important to educating the public and the decision maker to the health effects. And those health effects may be able to be mitigated or avoided. There are all sorts of innovations that can be taken to help these communities. One thing I want to mention too is that as the administration has been aggressive in taking information down from public sites, from sites maintained by EPA, from sites maintained by the Department of Interior, by sites maintained by the Department of Commerce, and on and on and on. This is really damaging to communities in general. And this is something that this committee can do something about with regard to oversight, right? If you want quick permitting, if you want efficient decision-making, you need information. You need an informed public. You need an informed decision makers, and we're losing some of that. I'll stop there.
Thank you for your responses. I agree that taking down information and not providing communities, especially those that have been burdened by these environmental injustices for years because they didn't have information and weren't allowed to even give their own input. And now, after years of doing outreach and working with community groups and trusted community environmental organizations that have a way of making sure that community members are able to give their input. And now I feel like we're going backwards in just to expedite the process, right? But there are reasons, these communities have high asthma rates, some of the highest in the country. They have higher cancer rates. They have higher rates of heart disease in the country. And this is why we need to hear from them. This is not about permitting purgatory. This is like a healthcare hell that communities like mine have for too long carried the burden of these polluters' harmful impacts on the community. And policies like NEPA provide us with objective facts on the ground and begin the conversation between community members, stakeholders, and industry. And that's why I don't think we should be dismantling NEPA. We need to properly fund it with science-driven expertise, the same hardworking experts that the Trump administration has fired. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Before we go, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the hearing record the following January 2021 secretarial order from the acting Secretary of the Interior under the Biden administration, suspending delegated authorities from the Secretary of the Interior, Deputy Secretary of the Interior, Solicitor of the Department of Interior, and all of the department's assistant secretaries, meant to slow down the NEPA's process. Without objection, so ordered. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Boals, thank you for joining us today. When we talk about NEPA, a lot of times we talk about the big projects, the mining projects, the transmission, the solar, the wind, et cetera. But your testimony is important because it reminds us that NEPA's failures are having on that impact American citizens on even smaller projects, those traditional roads and bridge projects that you build. Can you expand on the practical impacts that delays from NEPA often have on the fate of a project, as well as the local, county, and state governments that are seeking to build a road or a bridge or other traditional infrastructure?
Thank you. Typically, the contractor comes in downstream of the NEPA process, but where we see challenges is with the state DOTs and other owners as they attempt to go through the NEPA process. Just the uncertainty of the process causes delays. It causes budgets to be understated because of basically time is money, and the longer that it takes to get approvals. I think the NEPA process is good, though, to give communities and give the area a chance to look and see how the project will affect the area, both economically, geographically, but the delays in just, if you could standardize a process and stick to the process and let the process be the process, and everybody would understand what was expected.
And I think that you stated something really important. It's the clarity, the certainty that you need because that investment dollars have to meet the scope of the project. When you delay, it just gets more expensive as it goes along. I mean, I will just give you an example. I was a former chair of St. Louis County, Minnesota Transportation. And so if you had a project that was held up by NEPA and you didn't start it or it didn't get finished by early November, the ground's frozen. And then you don't get startup until road restrictions come off in late April or early May. That's a half a year, and we know that when we delay that, it costs more money the following year. And I will tell you that money comes from the taxpayers. It comes from the local municipalities that have to upfront that fund increase. And it's not easily done. It's not nice to do. That's why these projects, the certainty, the timeline, the timeframes, once you've met the environmental and labor standards, you ought to be able to go forward. Mr. Campbell, as an electric cooperative, the infrastructure you develop, build and utilize for delivery of electricity to customers is owned by the customers and individual cooperative members. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Ultimately, who pays the price for NEPA reviews? Is it these same customers and cooperative members?
Yes, our end consumers are our investors.
So every time there's a lawsuit, your members have to pay. Is that correct?
That is correct. And I think there was a gentleman, a congressman, that stated earlier that he had heard that some environmental attorneys are charging $750 an hour, and we have to pay those $650 to $700 an hour for their work.
When NEPA reviews face lawsuits and drag on weeks, months, or years longer than they should, who pays the increased costs and attorney's fees for these frivolous lawsuits? Is it the same customers I just mentioned and cooperative members?
Yes, it's the end consumers.
And so every time there's a lawsuit, it's passed on to your customers
That is
that are
correct.
looking for reliable, affordable energy, correct?
That is correct.
So just to confirm, isn't it a massive faceless corporations that ultimately have to pay the price? It's not. It's the customers
Yes, that's
that you
correct.
serve. It's individual Americans that have to pay these drawn-out, over-litigated NEPA reviews that are often challenged by a cottage industry of environmental NGOs like the Natural Resources Defense Council. Many of these NGOs get their money through American taxes, and then they fight for these good projects using American tax dollars often. And I think it's a shame that this cottage industry of lawyers, environmental NGOs like the Natural Resource Defense Council, among others, among many, continue to weaponize the NEPA on the backs of hardworking, everyday Americans that just want affordable, reliable electricity and affordable, reliable, traditional infrastructure. And I will yield. My time's up. Who? Oh. My good friend, Representative Dingell from the great state of Michigan. You're up for 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look, I want to make it clear that I'm always happy to be able to talk about NEPA. Many of you know that it was my husband, John Dingell, who worked on NEPA as the original author, was there when it was signed into law, and worked hard his entire career to keep the balance on this right. Today, though, it continues to be one of our nation's strongest tools in ensuring communities across the country have meaningful input on major federal actions. NEPA's directive is clear. The government must consider how a project will affect the environment. Communities and people affected by the projects must have a fair chance to weigh in on its merits. And this includes the consideration of environmental justice, climate change, and the full range of impacts on the land. And as our nation continues to face a worsening climate crisis, whether people want to admit it or not, it's imperative that the voices of those most affected in the communities are heard. I do agree that we need modern reforms for NEPA, but the continued partisan proposals we see from the other side of the aisle just stand to weaken NEPA and undermine the community's role in decision-making. This bill was passed and is still considered the Magna Carta, so communities impacted have their voices heard. And I've stated I remain open to an honest and open conversation to find a bipartisan solution to long-term NEPA reform that truly continues to protect our communities and streamlines NEPA for our projects. There is a misconception here that we need to choose between protecting bedrock environmental laws or accelerating clean energy permitting. Let me be clear. We can and must do both. Now I want to turn my attention to the witness today, one of them. Mr. Mergen, the two variables impacting time of approval timelines is the applicant and the administration. We hear from across the aisle that the federal review portion of the NEPA review causes significant delays. Mr. Mergen, during a NEPA review, can you clarify what is the largest contributor to approval delays?
For sure, the largest source of delay, the largest source of delay is inadequate staffing and inadequately trained expertise. And on the applicant's end, it's very important that they provide accurate and complete information. I think we've all been in the situation where the application is incomplete, there's inadequate staffing. These sorts of things create delays.
So, Mr. Mergen, to follow up, are the administration's recent actions, letting employees go, some will call it firing, related to the federal workforce helping or delaying NEPA reviews?
Substantially delaying NEPA reviews. We need a trained workforce. I'm not saying we need everybody. You can expedite with AI, with all sorts of informational tools, but you need a trained workforce, and we are losing those people.
So my final question for you is, across the aisle, we continue to see attacks on judicial review and hear that a majority of NEPA reviews are being held up due to these reviews. Mr. Mergen, what is the average number of NEPA reviews being challenged in court? And do these delays always result in an injunction or actual delay?
No, the average, I don't know that I have the most up-to-date information, but it's in the 20% range that are actually challenged. And I really want to focus on remedy and relief, right? Because the real source of delay, as we all know, is when an injunction is entered. And courts don't issue injunctions very frequently. And following the court's decision in Seven County, right, we are going to see far fewer injunctions entered against NEPA projects. That doesn't mean that those lawsuits can't be helpful in terms of improving those projects, but as a source of delay, I think we can anticipate a great decrease in the burden that litigation imposes, with one big exception, right? In order to defend the administration's NEPA decisions, you need an adequately funded Department of Justice at capacity. And those people who defend these decisions are also leaving in droves, and that will be a source of litigation problems. We already see the Justice Department asking for extensions of time to respond to cases because of the burdens of their workload.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have to yield back, but I am committed to working with you all on a bipartisan permitting reform efforts, but we got to make sure we do it in a way that protects the communities that we're representing. Yield back.
Thank you very much. Before we continue, I want to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record this spokesman review article from earlier this month that describes the 26-year NEPA process to get US 95 Thorn Creek Moscow upgrade completed. The original EA was litigated by special interest groups, and the Federal Highway Administration was ultimately forced to conduct an EIS. Without objection, so ordered. We are now going to go to Representative Crank for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. I was surprised to find out that all we need to do to solve this problem apparently is have more government employees, more government bureaucrats, more government lawyers to sue. Sounds like it's a winning strategy. I don't know why we haven't tried that over the last 40 or 50 years here. But the Breakthrough Institute found that litigation on average results in delays of 4.2 years. With energy infrastructure related litigation delaying project implementation by an average of 3.9 years. Even though agency decisions prevail over 70% of the time, litigation puts a strain on agency resources, and injunctions prevent projects from continuing. Plaintiffs and activist judges have taken advantage of NEPA's vague language to delay critical projects and boggle agencies down in additional reviews, often outside of the scope of the proposed action. And in this Seven-County Infrastructure Coalition decision, the Supreme Court reaffirmed that courts must give substantial deference to federal agencies in determining the scope of environmental impact statements. The court criticized lower courts for overstepping by requiring agencies to analyze impacts beyond the scope of the proposed federal action. This ruling marks an important judicial effort to rein in the overreach of environmental reviews under NEPA. However, very few NEPA cases ever reach the Supreme Court. Most are resolved in district and appellate courts, which have become the primary shapers of NEPA jurisprudence. This is especially concerning given that a disproportionate share of federal land use policy is shaped in the Ninth Circuit, where environmental plaintiffs are more likely to succeed. A 2016 study by the National Center for State Courts found that federal district courts within the Ninth Circuit reversed the Forest Service decisions 36.2% of the time, a statistically significant outlier compared to courts in other circuits. Mr. Herrgott, given the judicial overreach can undermine congressional intent and circumvent Supreme Court rulings, what tools or legislative reforms can Congress pursue to codify permitting reform and ensure that lower courts adhere to the limits set by the Supreme Court, especially when addressing these activist rulings that expand the scope of NEPA review beyond statutory requirements?
Thank you for the question. I think one thing just to underscore that is it's not just about the court cases and the litigation. In fact, project proponents are winning on a scale of 5 to 1 against the environmental groups. But when you get to a situation like Penn East or Atlantic Coast Pipeline that lost $1.8 billion for Dominion and Duke that was passed on to ratepayers, it's not the fact that you're losing in court. It's the fact that the capital is insanguinated. You no longer have the endurance. Your investors are pulled back. And every piece of capital of a project that is after that is baking in what the decision was and the subjective overreach of what those interpretations are of the overbuild, of doing those studies that are not required, because you don't want to land in court. So it's not just about the actual litigation stats, it's what it's done to the entire process, the gating mechanism before you even start. That's why an application now is 6,000 pages long and costs $50 million, a 300% increase from 4 years ago. So to tell you about agencies staying in their lane, working within their own administrative statutes, and if I may take 20 seconds more, the entire system was built on stopping pipelines, Keystone, XL, Dakota. When the Pipeline Fighters Hub would create this law book, how to stop pipeline projects, much like what's happening in this hearing today, it's a proxy referendum battle on climate change and fossil fuels, not on fixing the process, which is holding back more renewable energy projects than any fossil fuel projects at the moment. And I feel like we can't have a rational debate, and I got to go over and talk to Senator Lee and Senator Heinrich, because the hyperbole and the division here is not allowing us to have a real conversation about what's happening. And what's happening is the American people are suffering. Nothing is building. None of the projects from IRA, none of the fossil fuel projects, and I feel like we're having a Keystone XL battle from 10 years ago with talking points that are not borne out by the facts. And the beauty is, to your point, about the permitting debate is the facts don't lie. And the projects that are not moving are affecting all of us. And they don't belong to any political party in this room. They belong to the people that are putting the capital at risk, because 99% of our infrastructure system is funded by the private sector, and if they go away, they're gone. So if we don't put sideboards on the litigation risk, we're not going to build anything in this country.
Yeah, and to your point, it's easy for a lawyer who bills $750 an hour to afford these changes, but the average American, this cost is being borne by them, and that's who we ought to care about as policymakers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. I ask unanimous consent to submit for the record a green tape post titled NEPA Stats. It highlights how transmission projects undergoing NEPA see 31% litigation rates and 12% cancellation rates, and solar projects undergoing NEPA see a whopping 64% litigation rate and 32% cancellation rate. Without objection, so ordered. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Brownlee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Mergen, thanks for being here. You explained earlier the Interior Department's new alternative arrangements under NEPA and the impact on tribal lands. I wanted you to expound on that and talk about other impacts like oil and gas and other impacts.
Yes, thank you. You know, when I worked for the Bureau of Land Management in Wyoming, it was an interesting experience to work for a BLM field office where everyone knew the members of the community, right? They were in touch with those folks. And the NEPA process gave the neighbors an opportunity to weigh in on activities that were going to occur to them, whether those were oil and gas activities, whether those were mineral exploration, whether those were activities that would affect grazing allotments that they had. And that is absolutely critical that we build in this opportunity for public comment. And it is profoundly concerning that the Interior Department is taking those opportunities away, not just as a matter of fairness to communities and stakeholders and interested parties, but also as a matter of permitting efficiency, because DOI is inserting and injecting a lot of litigation risk in the way that it is dealing communities out of the process.
Do you think the oil and gas industry will exploit this new directive?
100%. I think that there are communities whose activities necessarily impact health and the environment, who will welcome this opportunity to shortchange process. I think that there are others who are genuinely concerned about the lack of stability that the instability that Interior is creating in its process, who want to hear, as the gentleman here with me today, want to hear from communities and are finding that the playing field is incredibly unstable as a result of actions by DOI.
Thank you. I wanted to talk a minute about the 7-county infrastructure coalition versus Eagle County, which limits the scope of environmental reviews and makes it harder for communities to seek judicial review. Mr. Mergen, in your view, how does that decision undermine the core benefits of NEPA?
I think we're going to have to wait and see how 7 counties affects NEPA overall. And I think that there are parts of the decision that are somewhat ambiguous. I mean, Justice Kavanaugh says in his writing for the court, says, we understand that there are downstream effects like water pollution that may occur remote in time and place. And those things need to be taken account of, right? And that is important, and it is categorically true. What we have to be careful is that the decisions focus on the project itself, and its limiting of foreseeability doesn't overly constrain the work and the NEPA analysis such that we lose important information about, for instance, cumulative effects. When the Forest Service is looking at a project that could affect a riparian area, right? It looks not just at that project, but it scopes out its future projects, so it has a good sense of what's coming. And that makes sense, and I think Justice Kavanaugh would agree that that makes sense, but we need to make sure that the agencies understand that that sort of look is appropriate.
Thank you for that. And last question, is if this committee were truly interested in serious, good faith conversation about improving the permitting process, what reforms would you recommend we consider?
First of all, I'm not saying, and I want to be clear on this, that we need 1 million more bureaucrats. What we need is a trained and professional civil service with expertise. And that goes for the Forest Service no less than our warfighters, the Marine Corps, or our public health professionals. And we are losing those people, and that is a big problem. We need to leverage technology. We all agree on that. Permitting can be speeded up. There are ways to do e-permitting. There are ways to use geographical information systems, geospatial tools, to make good decisions with fewer people if you have the people with the expertise who know how to interpret that. And so far as communities are concerned, we know that there are good tools for engaging communities early and often. And responsible project proponents do that work, and they utilize those tools. Some of those tools used to be available on government websites and are no longer there. And if we want to expedite permitting, we need to make information available to communities. Sorry, I went along.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Ladies, time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany, for 5 minutes.
Well, Mr. Chairman, one thing I'm really heartened about is the choice that my youngest daughter made to become an environmental engineer. It sounds like she has a bright future here based on the testimony that that we heard earlier. Mr. Herrgott, would you agree that delay is death?
Absolutely.
Did the originators of NEPA, did they envision NEPA becoming what it is today?
Absolutely not. When Rachel Carson put NEPA together, the idea that it would be used as an obstruction tool to fight a proxy war on fossil fuels that has now backfired would never have been something that she envisioned.
Yeah, I point to one of the products of NEPA is the chart right behind me. All you got to do is look at the blue line is fire, the green slashes are harvest on our national forest. And I believe the watershed year was 1988 when we reversed, or when we stopped managing our forests on federal lands in the way that we should. And I would just say, Mr. Mergen, in regards to your comments, we're losing all this expertise. What I hear consistently back home is that all kinds of ologists are being hired over the last couple decades in federal forest management, and foresters are in a significant minority. So when you talk about not having the people, we do not have enough foresters anymore, and that has resulted in this: far more fire, far less fiber being produced here in America. And I'll put some numbers to it. We did something called the Forest Practices Study when I was in the state legislature and did a rigorous review of state forest management. But I extrapolated those numbers to the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest, which covers about 1.5 million acres in northern Wisconsin. And over the last 3 decades, the estimates that I came up with, while crude, I think they're fairly accurate, $250 million worth of value that have been left behind on the national forest. But what's also left behind were families. There are a number of sawmills that closed as a result of that. I've heard from Representative McClintock what's happened in the Sierras, where they've lost dozens, if not hundreds of mills over the last couple decades. Well, something similar, while not on the same scale, has happened in northern Wisconsin as a result of this preservationist attitude that you can see with this chart. Mr. Boals, I'd like to ask you a question. Can you give me an example of a project that timelines are extended significantly for the American road and transportation builders? Do you have any examples where it's taken far longer than what it should to be able to build a project?
I don't have any personal examples where projects were hampered by the NEPA process, but in the written testimony, there are some of our members and some of my colleagues that have experienced that. I think some in a project in Arkansas, a project in Boston, and then a cited one in Oregon, where that delays have just extended the construction process to really beyond what anybody could imagine.
Does it end up extending it into decades, not just years?
I guess it doesn't extend, and I mean, it continues to extend until it's over.
So some of them are not over.
Correct.
Is what you're saying. Mr. Campbell, is it true the grid has become more unstable over the last decade, the electrical grid here in the United States?
Yes, it has. Load growth is significant now, and we've closed a lot of our always available base load power plants.
Yeah, I'm just going to close with this, Mr. Chairman. I want to know how long. We just had that iconic lodge up on the north rim of the Grand Canyon burned down in the last couple of weeks as a result of fire that got away that it appears should not have gotten away, and I hope we have an oversight hearing in regards to that. I want to know how long it's going to take to rebuild that lodge. And any guesses, if we have to go through this extensive EIS process, how long it's going to take. And I will just close with asking unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, to introduce a product here from the Breakthrough Foundation, the procedural hangover, how NEPA litigation obstructs critical projects. And they talk specifically about the Chico project in California. But I thought there was a very operative line in here. By delaying the project for years, Conservation Congress, an environmental outfit out of Canada, or Montana, likely did more damage to the natural habitat of the northern spotted owl than any amount of Forest Service intervention could have. I yield back.
Are you asking to submit that to the record?
Unanimous consent to enter this into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chair, I have something unanimous consent I'd ask to enter the record. It is a letter from Mr. Bruce, one second. Mr. Brent Wood, he's the president of Terminal Railroad Association of St. Louis, where they've received a Federal Railroad Administration grant, and they've been in the NEPA process for 3 years up to this moment, and I yield.
Without objection, so ordered. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Lee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for hosting this hearing. This is an incredibly important hearing, something that permitting reform is something I surely hope that this Congress can get across the finish line, and I know there's a lot of work being done, but nothing as important as what this committee's doing. I want to begin just to say the U.S. Energy Information Administrator, I represent Nevada, has noted that my home state of Nevada leads the nation in solar power potential, where nearly a third of Nevadans' electricity comes from solar. Similarly, there has been, the solar industry has invested $12.5 billion of private investment into Nevada, where there are 269 solar jobs per 100,000 residents. The bulk of that investment is, of course, rooted in our public lands, with nearly 12 million acres of federally managed BLM land throughout Nevada open for solar development. So clearly, this is a major industry in our state. Mr. Mergen, I want to ask you, is it fair to say that Nevada has the most to lose from the new DOI red tape requiring that the Secretary Burgum, a cabinet-level official, personally, I mean, this is key, personal, I mean, we're talking about permitting reform, so now we're going to go back and elevate decisions to the cabinet-level secretary to personally sign off on virtually every permit for solar and wind projects with a nexus to interior moving forward, including permittings for siting, road access, and rights-of-way.
First, let me agree that the potential for solar energy in Nevada is extraordinary, right? And we've seen some of that in projects that have been developed, not just on federal lands, but on tribal lands as well. Enormous potential. The interior memo, I think, goes against the grain of everything that we have talked about this morning across the board on this panel, which is that permitting reform should not pick and choose between infrastructure projects. The demands on the grid, the electrical demands that we anticipate really call for all sorts of energy, and the development of energy in Nevada, the incredible solar potential in Nevada should move forward expeditiously. And I think it can, in light of the reforms that have occurred under the Fiscal Responsibility Act. I think that the Seven County case is going to defang considerable amount of litigation going forward. That's litigation against fossil projects, and that's litigation against solar projects as well. I'll stop there.
Thank you. I completely agree. Mr. Campbell, do you agree with that we shouldn't pick and choose?
Absolutely. I think that's part of the problem with the NEPA process. One group doesn't like fossil fuels, one group may not like renewables, one group obviously doesn't like nuclear. You can't use that to kill a project, and I do think that is it.
Thank you. Mr. Herrgott, I find your record of government service commendable. Thank you. And I do hope that we can work together to find a bipartisan permitting reform solution. You testified earlier that your current role at the Permitting Institute is to rise above the rhetoric, political posturing, and gamemanship to drive compromise. So I appreciate that. In that spirit, would you say that the actions like this new solar and wind permitting directive, which comes just weeks after rollbacks on renewables enacted as part of the Republicans' budget bill, are getting us closer to bipartisan reform or driving us further apart?
I appreciate the question as someone that works with the Revia and Yellow Pine and has developed many assets and solar assets in Nevada. I agree with you. I will tell you that I look at that memo from a different point of view. The executive order came out at the beginning of the year, the way the president has messaged against wind and solar. The BLM state directors, Fish and Wildlife, were paralyzed to make a decision anyway, so nothing was going to happen. Elevating objective decision-making up to one person instead of pointing at 10 to blame Secretary Burgum, bring him up here, oversight, and halting it up there. You can't hide behind the bureaucratic charade. You have one person that just elevated the objective decisions. If he puts his foot and slows and we use it as a kind of soft obstruction, then you're going to be able to call that out. I think it's a shock to the system, and I think that's not the only agency that's going to happen to. And whenever there's a Democratic president, they're going to do the same thing, because the 65 decision makers spread across 25 divisions across the country that are disconnected are definitely not solving the problem.
Okay, so, but actually you, earlier in your testimony today, you claim that The system is so clogged up, there's no central database there. So you're basically saying because there's no centralization, but now we're all going to centralize it, it's going to make it faster. That just doesn't make any sense to me. I've been abundantly clear that I want bipartisan permitting reform. I think many people in this hearing today do too, but getting there will require some give and take. And this directive and the follow-up DOI directive basically is picking winners and choosers on the energy spectrum, and solar and wind being the loser. The majority has done, the majority has.
Time has expired.
Okay, I'm just going to say that we have an opportunity to work together, and I think we should really work together in identifying all forms of energy, not picking winners and losers. Thank you.
I look forward to working with you on that, Ms. Lee. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, the chair of the Education and Workforce Committee. Mr. Wahlberg, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the panel for being here today. And as we've read in your testimonies and heard today, NEPA was originally intended to be a tool for stewardship and economic development, not a weapon to block infrastructure and delay economic growth. But over time, it's become a bureaucratic maze, and I'm glad to see this handout today on our desk about that maze, though it's discouraging. One that adds years and millions of dollars to projects that are vital to our economy, our energy security, and our communities, and our taxpayers. Across the country, we're seeing highways and critical energy projects held up for years, not because of environmental harm, but because of paperwork and frivolous lawsuits. Those delays cost jobs, they drive up costs for working families, and slow the very innovations we need to strengthen our economy and our energy grid. We can support responsible environmental review without allowing endless red tape lawsuits to stall the things Americans need and are asking for: affordable, reliable power, good-paying jobs, safe infrastructure. Mr. Campbell, how do prolonged NEPA reviews affect the cost of energy infrastructure, and by extension, utility bills and fuel prices for working families?
So there's really two parts of that, and the temporary chairman talked about that a little bit. First thing is, the longer it goes, the more cost we have. We have cost in the project. It's more so probably there in the length and lengthening out the project, not getting it done, that cost our end consumers more money than the hiring of the attorneys. But there's also another cost. Right now, our industry is overwhelmed with load, and we need generation projects, and we need them right now. We need them built. And if we don't, there will be pain and suffering to the end consumer, because we're going to run out of power in this country in the near future. And that assumes no recession, significant recession, or data center bubble that bursts. We will, within the next number of years, run out of power. We have to have them now. We can't delay the process, because the pain and suffering will be when they don't have electricity.
Yeah, that's reminded to me this summer every time I turn on a specific light switch in my bathroom up in my bedroom, and it takes a while to get to full strength. And I live in the energy district of Michigan with nuclear, gas, coal-fired plants all across the southern portion of Michigan. So I agree with you. Mr. Herrgott, the Supreme Court's 7-county decision, which focused on the importance of federal agency deference in the NEPA process, has brought renewed attention to how the law is interpreted and applied. This ruling highlights the ongoing tension between the urgent need to accelerate permitting and the lengthy, burdensome environmental review processes. The 2023 Fiscal Responsibility Act included provisions that get back to the spirit of the original implementation of the law by imposing page and time limits, establishing a lead agency in the NEPA review process, and clarifying the definition of major federal action. It ain't perfect. You've indicated that clearly. But as federal agencies implement these FRA provisions and work to streamline permitting, What are some legislative solutions we could pursue to complement these actions, specifically to speed up the development of energy infrastructure projects needed to support American energy dominance?
Thank you for the question. Very briefly, reasonably foreseeable is a tort law standard dealing with causal link, right? And we're using that in an administrative NEPA case. The fact is, we use opaque language like reasonable and foreseeable, and then we wonder why, when it's interpreted on the outside or by the courts or by those citizen suits, that we have a problem. So the first thing to do is to legislate, is to statutorily codify the the seven-county decision, recognizing that that is just one law, NEPA. There's 55 other laws that you can sue under with the downstream theory, recognizing that I like to inject facts into a debate. I know that's difficult sometimes, but the reality here is that downstream effect was about 600 miles away of what happens at the Gulf Coast, 600 miles away from the project, and it also dealt with the marketing and displacement oil impacts from sales and utilization. That's not something that the Surface Transportation Board or any agency was ever intended to evaluate. So the first thing is putting sideboards on what is reviewable and what is allowable, and then first of all, it's making everything transparent and starting the clock at the beginning of the process, not the end. At that point, we will not have this exhaustive runaway system, and where projects are getting better and stronger and the administrative records are getting stronger, and therefore the litigants and the plaintiffs are getting more creative and more funded, and we have what we now have, which is theory for the sake of theory that has nothing to do with project impacts, and we're fighting a rhetorical battle in the courts that is outside and a contravention of what NEPA was ever set out for.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the ranking member, the
Chair?
gentleman from California.
May I enter into the record asking unanimous consent to enter into the record 3 letters, one from the Fervo Energy, which says basically public lands for geothermal. NEPA process on average takes 10 years or more. And then to what Representative Lee said, the NEPA process does not discriminate. 33% of NEPA appeals cases targeted renewable energy production. And then I ask, finally, unanimous consent to enter the record, the Niskanen Center project detailing that NEPA also has a significant impact on transmission lines, slowing transmission lines by a significant time period.
Without objection, so ordered. Also make an announcement in an effort to keep our dais on both sides of the aisle well nourished. There is food in the office for members if you care to step back there and have some lunch. And with that, I recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Herrgott, some of your testimony, frankly, has me perplexed and confused. You have said over the course of many years, and certainly even today several times, that you support an all-of-the-above energy approach. You said explicitly you want to see, for example, more offshore wind. You are aware, aren't you, that all federal permitting for offshore wind, for all offshore wind, categorically, is halted by order of the President of the United States right now? You're aware of that, right?
Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
It's not my point it's not my job to agree or disagree with a tax credit.
No, just yes or no, do you agree?
I think that anybody that puts capital at risk, people need to get out of their way.
So you disagree with the President's categorical stop on all federal permitting for offshore wind?
That has nothing to do with the permitting process.
Sounds like you can say it. It's okay to say it.
Elections have consequences. When a Democrat wins and they stop oil and gas, I don't get in their way. When there's capital put at risk and the project moves forward.
Mr. Herrgott, I got a little bit more here, because I heard you kind of awkwardly defending Secretary Burgum's new secretarial order that all solar and wind projects now have an extra layer of red tape. You said, well, maybe it's good to have them go straight to the secretary, cut through all of these underlings, all of this nonsense. It's been bogging things down, complicating them. But I have the secretary's order right here. It doesn't clear any of that underbrush away, any of that regulatory underbrush. It just adds more layers on top of all of it. A new special layer where they've got to go for subsequent review. They call it subsequent review to the Office of the Deputy Secretary, and then a new final review all the way to the big cheese, the Secretary of Interior. Can you truly believe that this is justified in the name of transparency and visibility and the other pretexts that you have offered? Do you truly believe that? That this is good for solar and wind?
If you allow me to answer the question, I can do it in 30 seconds. When you put out an executive order, much like the 250 executive orders that have this opaque guidance out to a GS-15 in the field who has no idea whether or not they're okay to make a decision, and then you don't follow it up with formative guidance, which this one is a 2-page memo that says, of the 69 decisions that are made that are relevant to a decision about a project that you already know that was tied to this executive order, it's elevated to the president or elevated to the S1. Elevation within these decisions was going to have to happen anyway. The BLM state director in Nevada or Arizona was not going to make a call, so it called out a spade what a spade was. In fact, putting your money where your mouth is and saying that it comes up to you after to reconcile with an executive order.
Sounds like you believe this is necessary for transparency and accountability and the other things that have been offered.
I have one person to blame, not 50 that I don't see.
I hear you. And so if this is so good for visibility and transparency, it sounds like you've offered kind of a good government explanation for these new layers of bureaucracy on wind and solar. Would you support that for oil and gas projects?
Absolutely. If the Department of Interior got the ability and Bergen could make a single decision and it was not spread across.
No, all of the underbrush is still there. All of the red tape is still there. You've just got 2 new layers on top of it. You think that's a good idea for oil and gas projects too?
There's not. A record of decision is signed by a line officer out in the field. The Secretary of Bergen at this point could authorize or deny a project at his will. That is the same sort of authority.
Reclaiming my time. Mr. Herrgott, you got a credibility problem. You're making a mockery of this notion that we need to streamline the regulatory permitting process. There is a big governmental thumb on the scale for oil and gas and an absolute war on clean energy, and everyone knows it. Unlike you, the folks in this administration will say the quiet part out loud. They want to kill wind and solar and offshore wind specifically. Mr. Mergen, you've been in this line of work for much of your career. Can you think of any good reason for all of this regulatory morass for solar and wind while having a big governmental thumb on the scale for fossil fuel, including mandatory coal project approvals?
I cannot. And, you know, I worked in the federal government for 30 plus years. And during that time, I worked with state directors in Wyoming, in Utah, and Nevada. And they are capable of making these decisions in a streamlined and efficient way, whether that's for fossil or for renewable. But it makes no sense to discriminate against this industry based on the testimony we've heard from Mr. Campbell today.
And Mr. Mergen, you've talked about how technology can improve permitting efficiency. We have a new tool at the Fish and Wildlife Service. It's called IPAC, this one-stop console that lets you more quickly navigate the regulatory process. But there's a little warning that pops up if you try to use it in your wind and solar project, you're not eligible. Can you think of any good reason why the efficiency of this tool is available for fossil fuel projects, but not clean energy?
I think it's the very definition of arbitrary and capricious. It makes no sense.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Alaska, Mr. Begich, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to our witnesses for being here today as we examine the critical need for permitting reform under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. NEPA was intended to ensure thoughtful environmental reviews, but over decades, it has morphed into a bureaucratic quagmire that stalls vital infrastructure projects, inflates costs, and undermines American energy independence and economic growth. A prime example is the 10-mile Cooper Landing bypass on Alaska's Sterling Highway, a project first conceived in the 1970s to improve safety on a beautiful but winding road that sees heavy tourist and commercial traffic. What should have been a straightforward upgrade has been mired in NEPA reviews for nearly 40 years, with endless environmental impact statements, public comment rounds, and land negotiations dragging on until the final EIS in 2018. Today in 2025, construction is finally underway, but the project won't finish until 2032, over half a century after initial planning. Costs have skyrocketed to over $1 billion for this 10-mile road, at least one order of magnitude greater than original estimates, all while Alaskans endure ongoing congestion, accidents, and economic losses. Unfortunately, this is not an isolated case. Across the nation, NEPA delays hobble energy production, transportation upgrades, and resource development weaponized by special interests to block progress. Republicans support responsible stewardship of our natural resources, but we must cut the red tape that turns years into decades. Reforms will streamline processes, reduce frivolous litigation, and get America building again without sacrificing environmental protections. My question, Mr. Mergen, in your written testimony, you state that NEPA does not warrant amendment, but colleagues in this committee on both sides of the aisle today seem to disagree. Is it your opinion that these folks are wrong and you're correct?
No. I think that I would clarify my written testimony to say that I think that this committee should be cautious about what steps it undertakes. And what I was really trying to get at is that there have been dramatic changes in the landscape within the last 2 years. And I think that so much of what we talk about in NEPA is sort of, and I would agree with some of my colleagues here, hyperbolic, right? That we need to take a considered look at this sort of thing. So to give you an example, I would certainly favor efforts to utilize technology in a way that can streamline NEPA processes. I think there are good examples, and the IPAC example that Mr. Huffman mentioned is a really good tool. So I want to be clear that I think there are steps that we can take. My overall point is that I think the landscape has dramatically changed, and that's the Fiscal Responsibility Act, and that is the 7-county decision, which I think is a very, very significant development. And I think that a lot of the downstream and upstream cases that we've been talking about before 2025 fall away in light of 7-county.
Let me ask you this as a follow-up. Also in your written testimony, you mentioned that NEPA is often improperly blamed for project delays. But we've heard from other witnesses today and regularly from folks in our districts that NEPA burdens and anticipated lawsuits are significantly delaying their projects and projects across the nation. Is it your opinion that all these businesses are incorrect?
I think that I would agree with Mr. Herrgott on something that he said earlier strongly, that what we need is more data, more information about EISs, more information about EAs, and more information about CEs, so that we have like a solid empirical look at sort of what the impacts have been down the line. Because I do think that when you peel away the layers on a lot of these litigation, it's not about NEPA. It could be about the Clean Water Act. You see that a lot in Alaska on some mining cases that you're probably very familiar with. And so NEPA gets the blame, and it's another environmental statute is the handicap. Now, you may say that just indicates that the environmental laws have gone too far. But what I would say is that when you blame NEPA unnecessarily, you lose out on the fact that it is purely procedural. It's not there to stop projects. It's there to inform the decision maker and the public. And I think we can all agree that that is a good, right?
I think that is a good thing. I think that we need to make sure that we limit the envelope for lawsuits to weaponize NEPA against the American people. We need to make sure that we continue to evaluate and reform this legislation. And it's encouraging to hear your testimony, the testimony from other witnesses and colleagues from both sides of the aisle calling for NEPA reform. And with that, I yield back.
The chair now recognizes Ms. Elfreth for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I've been sitting here listening because I spent 6 years at the State House, and I always engaged in committee hearings such as this as a meaningful opportunity to hear opposing viewpoints, try my best to find something in the middle. And so instead of doing anything performative today, I actually do want to challenge everybody at the witness table to try to find some common ground here, because as you've heard, everybody's heard today, I think we can all agree that the current process isn't always working for everybody, including our constituents. But that does not mean that we should throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I think it is laughable, if not ludicrous, to believe that we can take a sledgehammer to the civil service the way that DOJ and this administration have done and somehow expect greater efficiency. The math just doesn't math. So that being said, I'm going to challenge everybody at the table to find one thing you can agree on. And Mr. Mergen, you just began saying that you agree with Mr. Herrgott that we need more data collection. I'm going to challenge you. Anything else that you think you can agree with from what you heard today?
I think we all agree that there's a role for technology in all of this. I read Mr. Herrgott's testimony, and he makes a point, and I appreciated that it was colorful. He said that this statute originated in 1969 and 1970 when documents were made available through reading rooms. And I'm old enough to remember that, right? But we now live in a world where we don't need reading rooms anymore. We can make this information available to the public, and that will improve decision-making across the board. And, you know, honestly, the agencies are moving in that direction, and I think that's something we can also agree on. The information needs to be public. It needs to be accessible to all of your constituents.
Mr. Herrgott, you're up.
I would like to think that we could all agree that the system is broken, right? And I'd also like to agree that some of the hardest working, most valuable people are those line officers at the Army Corps of Engineers and are the line officers, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the ones that are still there, the ones that have been working to actually reform the program and push it through. And those people, many of which work with me at the Permitting Institute and worked with me at CEQ and the Federal Permitting Council, is that they are the backbone of the entire system. And making things tougher on them it just slows down the entire process.
I'm gonna push you all a little bit more. We can all agree on the problems. I'm curious the solution. So, Mr. Herrgott, I heard you say that valuing the civil servants who are actually executing these permits is something we need to get back to. Anything else?
Well, they don't have access to the AI, the automation, the large language processing tools to process the 6,000-page applications. So you have all the third-party contractors writing the applications, sitting on their desk, and they're expected to adjudicate something that they were not trained for, that is an overbuild, that is using modeling that they don't have the tools or the software for, and then we wonder why they're delayed. And so I think it's important for us to realize that you empower them, and then you recognize where the choke points are, and it's that we have overmatched federal service employees that are being sent some of the most complicated projects in the world. It is not Keystone anymore. It is something 10 times more expensive and more complicated, and you can't put that on a biologist's desk at a field office and expect them to be able to push it through the system. Recognizing that those are where the problems are and not fossil fuels or the Trump memo or other things, that we have fundamental process things that are going to transcend this presidency into the next one, and knowing that we have to fix the problem when we can't use politics to stop it, or else the next IRA that happens is going to have the same problem it did before.
So I'm hearing sometimes greater investment from this government will lead to greater efficiency in the output. Mr. Campbell, anything kind to say about Mr. Mergen's testimony?
So I do think there needs to be some changes. This rule and law came out over 50 years ago, and it's morphed itself into something much different that has caused issues with timing. And
Something you can agree on that has been said today, maybe not, you didn't think you would come to agree with.
So I think I have faith in this body, and what I like is you're going to take it and modify it to put boundaries, put people in boxes. We do that all the time with our trading floors, with our fuel desks. We put them in a box. This is your box, and I think you need to modify that and make some changes. I do think some things need to be changed.
Mr. Boals, with very few seconds left.
I would just add that I think we could all agree to just the clarity of the process and just everybody get on the same page as what the process is.
And I would hope that we are all here to strive towards the balance that is necessary for important, critical environmental protections with the ability to get big things done again in this country. And so I think we have a framework, Madam Chair, and I would love to build off of that framework moving forward. And with that, I yield.
Thank you, Ms. Elfreth. The chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes of questioning. I think it's great that we're talking about potential solutions, but you cannot look to solutions unless you're willing to admit what is the problem. And Mr. Mergen, listening to you today talk about NEPA, you live on a different planet than I have for the last 25 years in terms of practicing law and fighting against radical environmental groups as they have weaponized NEPA to stop every project and stop the ability to access and produce affordable and reliable energy. Mr. Campbell, you have several times referenced the desperate need for reliable and affordable energy. And the ranking member just threw a tantrum attacking the administration for its wind and solar policies. But everybody in this room knows that wind and solar are not affordable and they are not reliable. We have got to focus on the things that work. In Wyoming, we are the largest coal producer in the nation. But we also often say that federal coal is actually subject to triple jeopardy when it comes to NEPA. In other words, there's 3 different times that any one of our projects has to go through NEPA, 3 separate times. That is because the Office of Surface Mining recently made a policy decision disconnected from any statutory requirement requiring federal mine plans to also be subject to NEPA. 3 layers of the federal coal permitting process are now subject to NEPA review in Wyoming. So, Mr. Herrgott, are there other project areas that you are aware of that are subject to multiple rounds of NEPA?
I mean, if you could rephrase the question, I mean, I think what you're saying is the redundancy of the additional work that's being required that's not in current law?
That's correct.
Yes, I mean, the mission creep on that, courts are improvising and agencies are defaulting in fear, and in that absence, in that vacuum, project developers are left out on a limb with no one to back them.
And the certainty and stability is absolutely critically important for these large multi-billion projects to go forward, isn't it?
If we stay on this current path, I'm not sure who's going to invest in any project in this country. In fact, I would tell them not to. There is no predictable path to an ROI, and right now it's 7 to 8 years from the concept to just getting to a place where you're at the end of NEPA, and then you still need to build the darn thing. That's a 10-year window. That's 4 midterms and 2 presidential elections based on the abandonment rate of what's happening now with cases that are still winning in Supreme Court, but the project is already abandoned, like Atlantic Coast and Penn East. There is no reason why you would put $500 million, $1 billion behind any project in this country without a regulatory path, and the way in which NEPA has been co-opted to be a proxy fight against an energy source that people don't like because they didn't win an election.
So, Mr. Campbell, what does that do to our ability to produce reliable and affordable energy to meet the demands in this country?
So I think we need changes, and fossil fuel is not the enemy that everybody wants to make it out to. We have to have that. That's the always available generation. I think we need renewables, and we need lots of nuclear in this country too. But we have to somehow get through the red tape to where we can start to build.
And right now, because of the way that NEPA has been interpreted, the way that the environmental groups have used it as a weapon to stop these projects, that's an impossibility. Is that correct?
I think on both sides, whoever's trying to do it can manipulate the system, and you shouldn't allow that.
But we know how the system's being manipulated. We don't have to both sides this. The reality is that there has been a war on coal, a war on pipelines, a war on oil and gas for a couple of decades now. That is just the reality, and as a result, we're in the situation that we're in right now, aren't we?
I don't disagree with that.
Mr. Boals, what do you think about that? How do we go forward with these projects that we desperately need if we have NEPA in the current condition that it's in?
With a concise, defined process, I think is the only way to proceed in a process that's fair to all.
So we need permitting reform. We need to reform the way that NEPA is interpreted and applied. That is Congress's responsibility. Wouldn't you agree?
If NEPA is the process, I think you need to dig deeper and look at the individual permits. Could be part of the problem or the challenge. But if NEPA is the process, I think just outlining the process would be a great place to start.
Okay, I appreciate that. With that, I yield back.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
Madam Chair, may I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record this June 2025 report by Ember Energy showing that prices on battery storage have fallen so significantly that solar and battery storage can now provide affordable, reliable 24/7 energy even when the sun goes down. According to the report, the average global cost of these solar storage systems is $104 per megawatt hour, more affordable than new coal plants, which cost $118.
Without objection,
Thank
so
you, Madam
ordered.
Chair.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Min for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to build on some of the comments reflected in the article that was just introduced into the record. Currently, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, Solar energy costs $55 per megawatt hour, and over the next 20 years, that is expected to drop below $25 per megawatt hour. Wind right now is at $40 per megawatt hour, and that's expected to drop to $35 per megawatt hour. And since energy is kind of the backdrop of this particular hearing, I just want to note that an all-of-the-above approach to energy should have a robust place for renewables, particularly given that most economic experts out there believe that this is the industry of the future, that coal, fossil fuels, for a number of reasons, including the impacts they create on our climate, are seen as a 20th century technology. And at this time, I will just note that my colleagues on the Republican side of the aisle, along with President Trump and his administration, are engaged in concerted attack on clean energy, renewable energy right now. And this hearing is in the backdrop of that because many of us fear that what is being discussed as NEPA reform is actually an attempt to really eliminate NEPA or to render it essentially impotent. And certainly coming from California, I know the need for permitting reform. I took part in a lot of efforts to try to reform the California Environmental Quality Act, which is even more onerous than NEPA, and which has really hampered California attempts to build out clean energy infrastructure, to build housing, to build many of the things that we need in an advanced economic society. But it's hard to ignore the fact that this majority, time and time again, has tried to give away our public lands, including in national parks, to the fossil fuel industry, to mining interests, and that this, when in the big, beautiful bill or big, ugly bill or big, bad betrayal, whatever you want to call it, House Republicans tried and failed twice to include hundreds of thousands of acres of lease sales to big oil and other fossil fuel concerns. Right now, we are set to debate, and I think this is not going to happen this week, but perhaps when we get back, we are set to debate 3 Congressional Review Act resolutions that would overturn resource management plans in Alaska, Montana, and North Dakota, ignoring local community consensus just to pave the way for more fossil fuel development, which I'm told will largely go to foreign interests. We'll later consider a bill, probably when we get back, to weaken the Clean Water Act and make it easier for private companies to pollute our waterways and jeopardize our public health. And so again, it's hard to ignore this NEPA quote-unquote reform in the backdrop of all this happening. It's also hard to ignore it in the face of these massive cuts to the agencies that are responsible for trying to approve NEPA reforms. And so my first question, Mr. Mergen, is for you. What is the aggregate impact, in your view, of these staffing cuts that we've seen? Do they make our permitting reviews more efficient, or do they delay them?
They substantially delay. And I want to make clear that I think that there are steps, as I've indicated, that can be taken to enhance permitting. But I really do believe that begins with a trained staff with the expertise and relying on institutional knowledge. You mentioned the RMPs. The resource management plans, that's an arduous process. There are a lot of experts brought to bear, petroleum engineers, geologists, wildlife biologists, archaeologists out in the field, right? Making good decisions, productive harmony, right, that NEPA is intended to produce, right? We can move forward in a productive way. That making those decisions, and it is extremely hard to do without the staffing.
And when you cut 7,500 employees across the Interior and 15,000 at the Department of Agriculture, obviously that's going to have a huge impact on permitting.
Strongly agree.
And when you put all of those decisions on wind and solar permits, for example, as in the hands of one person, Secretary Burgum, what's the impact of permitting going to be there?
Further delay, but also I think a loss of credibility in terms of permitting reform efforts. Yep. There is bipartisan support, but if it looks like you're choosing sides, yep, you're going to lose the folks in the Democratic Party who are strong advocates for permitting reform.
And I will just close with this. I believe in environmental protections. I believe those environmental protections, including NEPA, need reform, but they do not need to be eliminated. In fact, it would be counterproductive to society as a whole to eliminate environmental regulations, to eliminate permitting approvals and things of that nature. And that, I think, is what many of us are concerned, that this is actually a Trojan horse. It is not meant to reform NEPA. It's meant to effectively eliminate NEPA. And with that, I yield back.
I would recognize myself for a unanimous consent. According to the National Hispanic Energy Council, Hispanic families pay 24% higher energy costs compared to the median American family. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter supporting NEPA reform from the National Hispanic Energy Council, which states that efforts to streamline the permitting process are not only a win for overdue energy projects, but also for Hispanic families who face above-average energy burdens. Without objection, so ordered. The chair now recognizes Mr. Hurd for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Herrgott, I read through your testimony in the appendix, actually made for some depressing reading in many ways. It looks like so many of the major infrastructure bills that we've passed that say we've streamlined permitting have not delivered on it. And actually, the larger the infrastructure bill, I think you pointed out, the less likely it is to address permitting reform that is needed to execute on these projects. One of the points that was raised earlier had to do with the page limits in the Fiscal Responsibility Act. One of our colleagues mentioned the 150-page limit for environmental impact statements and the 75-page limits for environmental assessments. Mr. Herrgott, are appendices to these reports included in those page limits?
Absolutely. Absolutely not.
So agencies can just offload analysis into appendices?
Absolutely.
Okay, so the bloat remains.
Yeah, absolutely.
In your testimony, thank you for that. In your testimony, you also noted that in many NEPA cases, the goal of litigation isn't to improve environmental outcomes, but to exhaust capital and stall projects that are no longer viable. Where's the funding for this litigation coming from?
It's coming from a cast of characters. They fundraise off of NGO money, but they also fund it off of groups that are actively fighting against fossil fuels, and in many cases, it's not even the environmental NGOs, it's competitors that have a different energy source and/or it's private property landowners. At the end of the day, it's a cast of individuals that have their own set of motivations.
Are you aware of any instances where government grants or proceeds from prior environmental settlements are used to finance those lawsuits?
I'm not aware.
Okay. You note that the Inflation Reduction Act gave $350 million for permitting support, but that the delays persist. In your view, is this proof that the bottleneck isn't just about funding, but about deeper structural reforms needed to NEPA itself?
Absolutely. If we have another bill with cosmetic fixes that doesn't actually fix permitting, but it says it in the permitting release, we're going to send the signal that we actually care about fixing the problem, and then it won't fix, and then we'll wait another 5 years, and the problem will get worse. The only difference now here is, for the first time ever, fighting and talking about NEPA as a rollback that's going to supercharge and erode NAGPRA rights, or 106 consultation with tribes, or it's going to, I like to use facts, there's no incident of that happening. NEPA's not getting torn down. Nothing's happening that the chairman or anyone else has proposed, and seeing ghosts and threat construction about making NEPA this big bad wolf when it's really just a statute to bring all these other statutes of that chart that I wrote a long time ago to a center so that we can evaluate the impacts and the mitigation. If it's a bad project, turn it down. If it's a good project, move it forward. We, at the end of the day, what has happened here is that on the front end, to your point, is that project sponsors on their own are spending that money to inoculate from an opposition and a theory that hasn't even been invented yet. Right? How do you write a project when you don't know what's going to be challenging you, because you can't even look at the statutes anymore, because the things that are actually setting projects aside, just like in Seven County, was not something that anyone could have ever envisioned.
Right. Mr. Mergen, I have a question for you. I read through your testimony and understand your point about the need to look at the FRA and how it's being implemented and wait and see. You mentioned having read Mr. Herrgott's testimony, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but I was curious about some of your feedback on a few of the points that he made about what the FRA required, and in his opinion, why that's not enough. Specifically, what do you think about this? And this is one that struck me as a reasonable point that he made, and I just wanted to get your response to this. Mr. Herrgott said lead agency designations and joint reviews, that process could be improved. He said lead agencies are responsible for setting and managing schedules, is what the FRA did. And his point was lead agencies, his criticism of it was that lead agencies were given responsibility without authority. They cannot compel cooperation, override disputes, or penalize delay. In practice, they're accountable for slippage, but powerless to prevent it. What's your reaction to that? Is that a good point? And in terms of that interagency relationship? And is that one area maybe where we could improve on the FRA?
Yeah, so I think that the lead agency aspect of this is an important one. I think it is important to have one agency take charge and manage the process. I think there are a lot of innovative ways to manage the process. We haven't really talked about dashboards today, but I think there is good evidence. I think Mr. Herrgott talks a little bit about that too, that dashboards can be very effective. The question that I think that you would have to think very hard about is whether the lead agency issue is better handled administratively, regulatory, by the people in the agencies themselves who deal with these issues day to day, rather than Congress trying to manage this process. I think that would be a mistake in the first instance. And I think to go back to some of my prior testimony, what we have is a very confusing situation created by the Department of Interior with regard to guidelines versus regulations and different direction on public participation to different agencies. All of that, to go to your excellent point about lead agencies, is going to make that extraordinarily difficult. So I think this all starts in the agencies, and that the agencies can demonstrate the leadership to make the lead, the designated lead agency process work.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mergen. My time has expired, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Stauber, do you have?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter three articles into the record. The first one was by the Breakthrough Institute titled Understanding NEPA Litigation, a review of NEPA court cases, which found that NGOs, non-government organizations, brought 72% of the total NEPA challenges between 2013 and 2022, and 35 of those challenges were brought by the 10 largest environmental NGOs in the nation, including the Natural Resources Defense Council. And quickly, on categorical exclusions, I ask unanimous consent to enter the hearing record the following May 2024 spreadsheet compiled by the Biden administration's Council on Environmental Quality, cataloging the hundreds of NEPA categorical exclusions federal agencies have had to develop and use to conduct their daily mundane operations, to include purchasing light bulbs, purchasing toilet paper, paying contractors, and conducting routine office renovations. Those numbers are included in the NEPA categorical exclusions. And then the last, Mr. Chair, is from Signal Peak Energy. I ask unanimous consent to enter the hearing record the following letter from Signal Peak Energy outlining the grueling NEPA process. 13 plus years the company had to endure for their Bull Mountains mine in Montana, and I yield.
Without objection, so ordered. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Dexter, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you again for this hearing today. I am heartened to hear the consensus that we need to use data, technology, and common sense to design a clear administrative process that works better for permitting. That is not, however, what this administration is trying to do, and I just want to be clear. Public engagement is being gutted to give handouts to oil, gas, and mining companies, and it's just offensive and irresponsible. Mr. Mergen, on President Trump's first day in office, he declared an energy emergency. I'm not sure what emergency we're in, but we'll leave that for another day as the #1 producer of oil and gas in the world. In response to this so-called emergency, the Department of Interior issued what they are calling alternative arrangements for NEPA compliance. The Bureau of Land Management approved a uranium mine in just 11 days. Mr. Mergen, do you believe there was any legitimate consideration of public concerns, tribal consultation, or consideration of alternatives in that 11-day process?
No, I do not.
And thank you for that. And can you tell me about the precedent for this? Under what circumstances have alternative arrangements been used in the past, and why is this one different?
Yeah, there is the CEQ, which has at various times done a good job of collecting information and at other times a very poor job, has kept information about the way alternative arrangements have been deployed historically. And by and large, those arrangements have been deployed in response to natural disasters. They have been deployed in response to, catastrophes like fires and the like. And here we're seeing it leveraged for an energy emergency, and yet there doesn't seem to be much evidence of that emergency. And so it's a radical departure. And I think, to those folks who may agree with these streamlining efforts, I would say it creates enormous litigation risk. The Supreme Court has told us again and again, told the Biden administration again and again, when you do things that are out of the norm, sort of extraordinary, you are going to lose in court. And that is exactly what this administration has done.
Thank you for that. And I just want to, I'm not sure how much time I have, Mr. Chair.
I'm
so-
not either. We're trying to
Okay.
figure the clock situation
All right,
out.
so
I'm showing
I'm
2
gonna-
minutes and 30 seconds
Perfect.
remaining here.
I'll assume we've got at least that much. An effective permitting process clearly is essential for clean energy, lowering emissions, reducing energy costs, and at the same time, development must be paired with early, meaningful engagement from local communities and tribal nations. Mr. Mergen, how do we strike the right balance between moving essential development forward, we've been talking about this somewhat already today, while still being able to consult with the public and make sure that they have a meaningful voice, but not a burdensome voice in the process?
Yeah, thank you for the question, because I totally agree that there are times at which public engagement is played out and burdens the permitting process. And I think that the lessons we can draw from those examples relate to how early the engagement occurred, how much work was done at the front end. And I do agree with Mr. Huffman, who indicated that this understanding the community is a part of the due diligence that any project developer undergoes, and figuring out how to communicate with that community the benefits of your project, the burdens of that project, is really important. FERC has recently adopted a process to engage earlier, right? And that process has shown a lot of potential. And so, and you started off your comments by noting the need for information. And I go back to that again too, because we see the administration stripping down information. If we can direct the public to information about the effects of an action that have already been collected, we can make their engagement effective, or maybe even mitigate the need for that kind of comment altogether.
No, I very much appreciate that.
Will the gentlelady suspend?
I just
When
magically
the
got more
clock was
time.
reset, you had a minute 20, so when it gets down to 3, your time will be expired. We'll give you the benefit of the doubt.
I appreciate that. So I just want to double down on that, because I think data-informed decision-making has to be where we are headed for transparency and accountability. And so I'm hearing that across the board. I also think that equitable application of those processes, like with the IPAC and other formulations, we cannot and must not put the thumb on the scale for oil and gas while handicapping others. I would just offer the last question to you, because I think I magically did get extra time, but what strategies do you think would be most efficient and effective for getting public engagement? Is it using technologies ahead of time? I would love your insights in that, Mr. Mergen.
Yeah, for sure, technology makes a huge difference. We've talked about IPAC several times today, and if you look at that, it's so common sense. It's an ESA tool, and it leverages technology in a way that absolutely streamlines decision-making for project proponents, but also tells the public about the environment that's going to be impacted. And I think technology is the way forward.
Very good. The last thing I want to just add is it would be helpful, I believe, to note when Clean Water Act or Clean Air Act or other things are the burden and not NEPA, because I think NEPA is being unfortunately mischaracterized as being the handicap in many of these processes. With that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from American Samoa, Ms. Radewagen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Westerman and Ranking Member Huffman, for holding this hearing today. Thank you to the panel for your testimony. Some of this was covered in your testimonies and even just not too long ago. But I would like to hear more about the role you think technology should play in permitting reform. And let's start with Mr. Herrgott and then open it up to the rest of the panel.
On the technology side, I think that, we're still probably a couple years away from AI and the trust in its reasoning and its methodology on how it arrives at risk-based decisions. But clearly, it could save about 30 to 40% of the current permitting times just on reading these expansive documents and processing a layer of expansive data. We are doing reviews on things that have already been done before. There's a tremendous amount of redundancy. CEQ is working on that as we speak. Yes, we can all find common ground on the technology piece, but at the end of the day, I don't want that to distract from the fact that there is fundamental structural reform that is required.
Mergen?
Yeah, I think we're actually a little bit closer on I think we're actually a little bit closer on being able to leverage technology in terms of expediting permits. There's an article recently in The Hill published by Dave Owen, a law professor in California, and Timothy Mayle, who runs the Environmental Policy Information Center, EPIC. And they noted that AI seems to be at the point where general permits could be processed effectively. So I think we're closer on the AI, and I think technology is something that we're going to be able to leverage going forward.
Mr. Campbell?
So I'm not an expert in this, but I will say time is of the essence. We must move quickly because we need large power plants now and not in the future. And if we wait too long, the catastrophic event and the pain and the suffering will be much larger.
Sir?
Yeah, I'm not sure that this is in my wheelhouse either, but I would just recommend that any type of e-filing or where the documents can be shared or easily accessible and submitted would definitely improve the process.
Mr. Herrgott, you make some interesting points in your written testimony about the excessive litigation of projects, and I believe the phrase you used was, "the rules have become unknowable." Are there any concerns that narrowing the scope of regulations might actually lead to increased litigation if stakeholders feel their concerns are not being adequately addressed? And in your opinion, what types of changes need to be made to increase rules clarity rather than muddy the waters further?
My team and I made a former federal gatekeepers at the agencies, and that's what permitting decisions is made up. So when we speak from a practitioner standpoint, use ChatGPT to come up with all these different projects and what we would throw at it, the kitchen sink, the 30 different things we would throw at it, and you would think they were crazy, but they're not. The fact remains is that when Congress doesn't legislate and we allow the interpretation of opaque statutes to be determined by the courts and by rotating, evolving change in political leadership in the agencies without any clear, definitive statutory guideposts, guardrails, litigation will prevail because at the end of the day, there can be 99 people behind the project. It only takes one person to oppose it. And having simple legislative changes, for instance, on the 7 counties case, and keep in mind, this committee is the one that springs it loose. The Resources Committee, if you guys can come together and find some common ground on even just codifying 7 counties, which basically just says the impact needs to be geographically proximate or within the regulatory jurisdiction of the lead agency or the result of a direct causal relationship between the proposed action and the effect in question, excluding effects arising solely from third-party, market-based, or international conduct. If we can't get that passed, then what are we doing here? Eminently reasonable, but it'll probably be opposed as a rollback of NEPA. And that is why it is so difficult to do my job, because I'm trying to bring people together like I did with Senator Inhofe and Boxer for 12 years, passing some of the most remarkable permitting legislation. We worked with DeFazio and Oberstar and members of the House. Right now, we have to put aside these legacy battles that we've been fighting and the scar tissue we have on oil and gas versus wind and solar, put that in a different box and then fix the process, or else it's going to continue to get abused.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
The lady yields back. I want to thank our witnesses for your patience today, and we've been going almost 3 hours, so we're going to take an approximately 5-minute recess and start back promptly at 1 o'clock. The committee's in recess. The hearing will come to order. Ask everybody to please take their seats, and we will resume with questions. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Soto, is next for questions. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The National Environmental Policy Act has been a critical law to help protect my constituents for decades. And we do know that from time to time, there'll need to be reasonable reforms. I know Mr. Peters, who you'll hear from in a little bit, also agrees with me on this. When you look at my district's history, we had the Kissimmee River channelized. It cost tens of millions of dollars to do that, and it cost us nearly $1 billion to fix it. Because when that happened, it was an environmental catastrophe that took water away from ranchers, that shot nutrient-rich water right into the Everglades and hurt local species. So we know we do need to look at these major projects. Otherwise, it could cost us 10 times, if not 100 times more. My constituents would know about the I-4 Ultimate Project, which is our main road going through Central Florida, which has been a good partnership between the federal agencies and our Florida Department of Transportation, as well as interstate clean energy projects, which are struggling sometimes under the NEPA review. So it's critical to have environmental analysis, public comment, permitting. I know those things are being fought right now. In the case of I-4, we had a silt flow that was going on I-4 during the construction period during hurricane season, and so public input was key to help adjust our local highway. Then we had the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which created some rules of the road in 2023, creating a lead agency, environmental impact statements that had to happen in 2 years, environmental assessments within 1 year, page limits of 150 pages for the environmental impact statement and 75 pages for environmental assessments. And then, of course, we've heard about 7 County Infrastructure Coalition v. Eagle County that limited assessments on upstream and downstream effects. So there have been legislative and judicial reforms that have happened. I know it seems like in this hearing that there's a lot of talk about nothing happening, but we know there's been 2 major reforms, one by the courts, one by this body. Mr. Mergen, how are these reforms going so far in practice since they've only been about a year, 2 years old?
So, I mean, even before the 7-county case, we saw course corrections from the courts, right? In 2009, the Ninth Circuit heard a case called Lands Council versus McNair en banc. And in that case, an en banc court, meaning all of the, it's essentially half because the Ninth Circuit's so large, but 11 members of the Ninth Circuit unanimously said, our NEPA case, our environmental law has gone a little bit off the rails.
But specifically for the Fiscal Responsibility Act, how have those reforms gone, the legislative reforms?
I think we don't have enough time to say for sure how it's going because it's only been 2 years. But I think the experience is that the agencies are going to be able to make this transition. All of these documents historically have been redundant and repetitive, and so meeting these page limits, I think, is not going to be an impossibility for these agencies.
Okay. And then, Mr. Campbell, I know you've been working on some major new projects in both solar, natural gas, and others in Kentucky, and been working with Governor Beshear on these projects, and we're quoted as saying we need both reliable power plus decarbonization over time. Walk us through some of the challenges you've had through NEPA on these clean energy projects you're working on that were funded through the Inflation Reduction Act.
We haven't gotten that far to where we have had the challenge with NEPA. These are all very fresh projects that we just got Public Service Commission approval, so we're just moving down and signing contracts. So I'm sorry I can't share that with you.
Based on your experience with past projects, what are you concerned about as you're trying to modernize Kentucky's energy?
So, well, if you're talking about modernize Kentucky's energy, that's a long story, and I'll dive into it.
I'm defining it as these projects that you're working on for the purposes of this conversation. What are some of the roadblocks you think you'll face ahead that you're concerned about?
Yeah, I think EIS studies that go on too long, we need to get these projects on as fast as we can, is an issue. We've had transmission issues when we have to have NEPA projects with transmission issues.
Do you think the 2-year limit and the 150-page limit will be some improvement
That
as
will
we
help.
work through these?
That will help. I would really like this body to put that in granite by Congress and not have the judicial system weighing in and not having others weigh in. I'd like to see you put that in.
Well, as you know, the Fiscal Responsibility Act that put those into power was a bipartisan piece of legislation that a lot of us voted for. So I appreciate your feedback on this. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New Mexico, Ms. Stansberry, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, it's always interesting to come to these hearings, especially after we've had many, many hearings on the same subject, and especially 2 weeks after a massive bill passed and was signed into law by the president in the Big Ugly Bill, which had major policy reforms to the actual policies that we're here to discuss. And 2 weeks certainly isn't even time to begin to implement those changes. So I guess my question is, when is enough enough? Why do we keep coming back to the well to discuss the same things over and over and over again? And I've worked in the field of water resources management and infrastructure, permitting, planning, and environmental reviews my entire career, over 2 decades. And so I've seen this conversation happen in a million different places, in a million different ways. And, you know, my second question after when is enough enough is, what's the end goal here? Is the end goal to repeal NEPA, or is the end goal actually to solve problems in the permitting process? Because the data is very clear that the primary reasons why projects get delayed, as Mr. Mergen and others, and just the thousands and thousands of data points that we have on permitting delays, is that it's either delays that are caused by permittees themselves not submitting appropriate paperwork or studies or plans, or it has to do with a lack of appropriate staffing at these agencies. When I worked on the Hill and worked in OMB, I worked on these issues for years. In fact, I was part of one of the first permitting councils that was set up by the Obama administration as a career staffer at OMB. I was working on the Hill when FAST 41 was passed to reform the permitting process. I was here in this chamber in 2013 when literally the Republicans took the entire global economy to the brink and said if we did not get NEPA reform as part of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, the end of the world would happen. And here we are 2 years later, and they just got major reforms passed through reconciliation. So I'm like, what's the end goal, right? Like, what is the end goal here? When NEPA was passed in 1969, it was a bipartisan bill. And the reason it was a bipartisan bill is because at the time there were these massive dam projects being built all over the United States. There were massive mining projects. There were massive roads. There were huge federal actions that were impacting communities. Whole communities, for example, in inner cities were getting bulldozed for federal highway systems. You had, rivers that had cultural significance, and there were treaties on with tribes that were getting dammed, and the fisheries were being stopped. So the idea was that maybe we should take a minute before we approve these federal actions. Maybe we should take a minute and talk to the communities, find out how they feel about it, find out if there's resource conflicts with other extractive or other activities, find out if we want to preserve it because it has unique cultural value or environmental value, and then we make a decision. And the reason why it takes a long time is sometimes these projects are so complex. It takes a while to figure out whether or not this is the right course of action, because for millennia, this is how the earth operated and how cultures interacted with this landscape. And you don't want to make a snap judgment in 120 days or 90 days or whatever arbitrary permitting requirement this body might pass. But I think the part that I find particularly disturbing is that the things that I'm hearing across the aisle being put forward, like, for example, taking away the public ability for judicial review and comment is exactly the stuff that they tried to shove into reconciliation, and which the parliamentarian ruled was non-germane. And the reason why it got stripped from reconciliation is because they didn't have 60 votes to pass it in the Senate to begin with. Because it's a bad idea. Because the whole concept of taking away public review is actually gutting NEPA. So what's the end game here? The end game is to gut NEPA. We all need to make permitting more efficient. But, you know, I heard a lot of rhetoric today about like, oh, we're not going to be able to build this infrastructure. You know, I've been meeting with utilities for the last 2 weeks in the wake of the big ugly bill passing. And you know what the #1 threat to utilities is right now? It's the big ugly bill, because they cut the federal subsidies for grid modernization. Every major utility and clean energy company and financial institution that holds equities in real property in utilities right now is in financial crisis because of the big ugly bill that you passed 2 weeks ago to gut federal subsidies. So if you're concerned about infrastructure, about energy security, about making sure that Americans' utility bills are cheap, that we can get energy to market, then why do all of your policies seem to completely point in the opposite direction? That's my question. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Virginia, Ms. Kiggins, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding the hearing to discuss the implications of the National Environmental Protection Act. I believe NEPA was enacted with good intentions to ensure development does not come at the cost of our environment. However, over time, it has turned into a long, complicated process that unnecessarily extends projects, drives up costs, and leads to uncertainty for businesses. Whether it's building roads and bridges, maintaining our forests, expanding and improving our military infrastructure, or developing energy projects, these delays often hurt communities that need these projects the most. As you know, my district and the surrounding areas are home to the Navy's East Coast Master Jet Base, Naval Air Station Oceana, the largest naval base in the world in Norfolk, and tens of thousands of service members across Hampton Roads. Not only do NEPA delays impact private sector projects, but projects for the military must also undergo strict permitting and siting processes. The cost of delays for defense projects is not just financially, but directly impacts our national security and readiness. We've been trying for a very long time to home the F-35s on the East Coast. Right now, they're currently just on the West Coast, but the process of getting this next generation strike fighter to Naval Air Station Oceana really comes down to permitting and this environmental impact study. And it's become a source of great frustration for me personally, knowing that money follows the new toys, knowing that we need the infrastructure investment on the East Coast. I want to get those F-35s. I want to get the FAX, the next generation strike fighter, to the East Coast Master Jet Base, which I'm sure I don't need to explain why the East Coast is important to our national security. So, Mr. Herrgott, thank you for discussing the real cost of procedural drift and delays. Could you elaborate on how NEPA can impact military readiness and how we can improve and expedite the process so we can move forward and get some of this environmental permitting just done quicker?
Thank you for the question. Much like the $14 billion of wind and solar and non-fossil fuel projects that were initiated within the last 5 years that are held in limbo because of changes at BLM on soft triggers on the sage grouse, which creates a new subjective standard of what is priority habitat and what is OHMA, meaning like the species are in the occupied habitat, and what is outside the habitat. In the case of Fallon Air Force Base, and I'm happy to provide, if the chairman would allow, I have a list of 50 examples from each sector: data centers, hydro, wind, solar, because the facts are going to sell this thing. It is not about hyperbole and just saying, I'm not sure why we need to erode NEPA, when the facts on the ground show that the projects that affect everyone and everyone's constituents, empower, and we can have a battle about NEPA and stripping it back. But when it comes to Fallon Air Force Base, in particular, where Top Gun, it was 3 years and $12 million and 3 different biological opinions on a species that is 12 miles away. And it's not even their priority habitat. It's habitat that once was OHMA, which you mitigate for, and still they had to do sound and vibration tests that were exhaustive in nature. And there's Camp Lejeune, and I have there all these different examples where you're doing reviews on, and the DoD guys get it the worst, especially the formerly used defense sites. They're willing to do the study. They hire AECOM, they hire Tetra Tech. That's the misnomer about all of this. The federal folks inside the agencies are not writing the EISs. Let me be clear. It is high-paid, high-equipped third-party contractors that are hired on the front end write their environmental reviews. It is incumbent on them. That is why the overbuild is happening, because they get fired, and the person who in the company that's the program officer, including a base commander in the Army, is not going to allow this project to get set down. So they overbuild the application. They put everything they possibly can in it. And typically the fights are either about private property rights, or they're about some other issue, and you go to the code and you pick up the environmental inventory of all the laws, which I have right here, 85 of them on DOD. NEPA's only 2 of them. All these others feed up into NEPA, and they're on that list. You can figure out a subjective statute on all of them. And on those wildlife statutes under ESA, it is a may affect, or a will affect, or likely to affect, or not. Those kinds of decisions are subjective decisions that are being made in the field. And right now, those you are not incentivized as a federal employee, as hardworking as you are, for speeding a project up. You just don't get that. You don't get a 5, but you will get your hand slapped if you do something wrong.
We need to find a way to incentivize and expedite that process, because it's starting to impact national security. And my East Coast Master Jet Base, my East Coast Carrier Air Wings cannot do the mission that they are sent on aircraft carriers to project air superiority throughout the world without the latest and greatest next generation strike fighter. I cannot get them in place. And oh, by the way, this Master Jet Base has been home to a wide variety of aircraft since the end of World War II. So we are not immune to noise issues, all the other environmental impact issues that we can study, that we've gotten through those hoops before. We need to get this done, because they've told me 4 years is what it's going to take to be able to get F-35s. And then, oh, by the way, I've got FAXX on the horizon after that. I need those on the East Coast. The West Coast has been prioritized. They are at Naval Air Station Lemoore. I got the East Coast and the West Coast. But I do not need to explain the importance of East Coast military in our fight to maintain peace, especially in places like the Middle East. So thank you for explaining that process, because it is starting to impact national security and is a concern for me. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. At this time, the chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Hoyle, for 5 minutes. Ms. Hoyle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for taking the time to travel here today. I think all my colleagues would agree that we need to build more and improve our infrastructure in every corner of our country. Our roads, bridges, even our broadband infrastructure are far behind comparable countries. And on this committee, we should agree that investing in infrastructure brings high-quality jobs and economic growth. I also think we can agree that we can build and develop more while also protecting our environment and tackling climate change. It should be a both-and approach. However, in order to do that, we have to reckon with the fact that under the current permitting system, projects take way too long with a convoluted, burdensome, and non-transparent process. It's why I was proud to work with Representative Garrett Graves to pass legislation to build an online portal so that people, whether in affected communities or developers, could track the process without spending $1,000 an hour for a lawyer, because my constituents can't afford that. Look, we need project sponsors to work with communities to address the issues before beginning the NEPA process. We need public input, environmental safeguards, and also a clearer path to getting to yes or no if a project won't move forward. Waiting 15 years to get a no is not reasonable, and we've had that in my district. We need clarity in these decisions in a reasonable time period, and at some point, we've got to do the hard work of figuring out how to make it easier for the best possible projects to move forward as quickly as possible while prioritizing community, tribal consultation, environmental protections in meaningful ways for communities to have input, building standards to ensure the infrastructure that we're investing in is built with the highest quality workforce with registered apprenticeship utilization to train the next generation of tradesmen and women. And we can do all this if we're willing to have those real conversations in this committee. And that's on Democrats as well as Republicans, but it doesn't mean just gutting everything. So I'd say, Mr. Mergen, I know you've addressed this, but what are the most common causes of project delays?
The most significant cause of project delay is lack of capacity in the agency and agency expertise to process. I do think, I think one of the things that we agree on is that we need more study of this. Not all EISs are prepared by contractors. Some are prepared in-house. Whether contractors are doing the EIS can add to delay, and it can also make it more expeditious. But the fundamental problem is the lack of capacity. And then also you need to have good documents submitted to move forward on, right? And you need to leverage technology, and the portal that you mentioned is an important way. We can come up with these mechanisms like dashboards and the like that alert people to where things are in the project, to obviate the need for them to get lawyers to see where things are going. So it's all of those things.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Campbell, I represent Oregon's 4th Congressional District, mostly rural, has a larger land area than Denmark or Switzerland. And as of last year, there were over 50,000 households in my district that were unserved by broadband. I'm 3 miles outside the city. We got high-speed internet in the end of 2019, and the people up the road from me still don't have it. Never mind Frontier and our much more rural areas. So I think we should be approaching this the same way we did rural electrification. So I'd like to ask you, A, if you were able to successfully use funds for broadband that were included in the IAJA, and how do staffing shortages at federal agencies impact the process to get permitting?
So let me answer the second question. I'm not sure how staffing has impacted it. And we don't do broadband ourselves, but our owners do broadband. And they've taken upon themselves, and they were really requested by the governor to take the lead on serving rural areas with broadband, because we've got the poles there. And many of them are doing that. Some of them are just facilitating that with contractors because they really didn't want to get in the broadband business.
And would you agree that it is critical that we get broadband to our rural and frontier communities as the same level of priority that we did with rural electrification, and with that same kind of federal investment, interest, and energy?
We do. We as co-ops believe that it's in our interest to facilitate that.
Thank you. I yield my time.
Gentlelady yields her time. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Arizona, Ms. Ansari, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Westerman. We have a cost of living crisis in this country. When we're talking about the build out of American infrastructure and energy, we absolutely cannot ignore the clean energy tax credits that President Trump and congressional Republicans just gutted with the big ugly bill. According to the Rhodium Group, an independent research group, Republicans' recently passed bill could increase Americans' household energy bills by up to $200 in 2035. Electricity prices could increase by nearly 20%. Total energy expenditure by industry could increase by $7 to $11 billion. That's another tax on domestic manufacturing and small businesses, which Republicans claim they support, all because renewable energy poses a threat to fossil fuels market share. First, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter this report into the record. It's titled, "What Passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill Means for the U.S. Energy and Economy."
Without objection. So
This
ordered.
data clearly shows that the repeal of these tax credits is going to drive up prices for American consumers. We all know that the energy demand is growing. Meeting that demand will be a challenge, but we must do so quickly and in a way that doesn't drive up prices for working families. According to S&P, U.S. gas-fired turbine wait times are as long as 7 years. Costs are up to 2.5 times in some markets. As long as there isn't political interference, solar and wind can be deployed significantly faster than that, and often cheaper even without tax credits. But a point that I feel is often missed, renewable energy will still be developed in the United States despite President Trump's qualms, because people in this country still care about climate change, and they know that wind and solar are cost competitive, reliable, and will not make their families sick. But without those tax credits, Mr. Mergen, will electricity cost ratepayers, less or more? More. These tax credits were an investment in clean, affordable, and yes, reliable energy of the future, and a commitment to addressing climate change. It benefited American families. It didn't hurt them like fossil fuels do by polluting and exacerbating the climate crisis. Despite this administration's war on clean energy, I promise that we will keep fighting for a better future. Moving on to the question of NEPA, Mr. Mergen, another question for you. Before you began teaching, you were a longtime attorney in the Department of Justice's Environment and Natural Resources Division, where you defended agency NEPA decisions spanning multiple administrations. Prior to your legal career, you worked at the Bureau of Land Management in Wyoming. You've seen a lot of the NEPA work firsthand. What have you learned about our procedures, where there is room for improvement, but also why these procedures are important in federal decision-making?
Yeah, there's a lot packed in there, and I'll try to be brief. I think there's no question, right? I want to be a credible witness here for everybody that litigation has created problems down the line for the implementation of projects. And those are clean energy projects, and those are fossil fuel projects, those are infrastructure projects. But the trend is entirely in the right direction. Courts are playing less of a role as spoilers in litigation, and that's important progress. And I think that's something the committee needs to keep in mind as it wrestles with these issues. I want to turn to the important role of the public in this process, because I think that's not obvious to those of us who spend our time looking at the court cases. I think many, many projects are improved across the board by public engagement. Mr. Campbell, I think, talked about a wetlands mitigation project that his company, that his cooperative was involved in. These things happen every day as a result of public engagement in NEPA processes. Every day, mitigation steps are made because the public has a good idea. They see that you're building infrastructure and they say, maybe you can help us out here. Maybe you can help us with a park. Maybe you can mitigate these effects. That happens every day. And when we cut out public participation, we lose the common sense that the public can bring to this process.
Thank you. I yield back.
And lady yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Fulcher, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for holding this hearing today, to the panel, for your participation, and just, if nobody has said this to you yet, forgive some of us for having dueling committees. So if you hear some reruns here, you'll understand why, I hope. And I think I'm going to make sure and give you one at least rerun, but for Mr. Herrgott anyway. But you haven't heard it from me, so I'd like to get some feedback on this. But I'm talking about NEPA here, in the NEPA process. And on average, it's my understanding that a U.S. mine project takes somewhere between 7 and 10 years, on average, to permit application through final process. And I would just augment that by saying we did just get one permitted, the Stibnite project in Idaho. And I believe that was 18. And so that's a real troublesome number to me. But in Idaho, Caldwell Canyon's mine, the NEPA process began in March of 17. It was forced to restart in June of 23, and it's still ongoing after 8 years. Mr. Herrgott, sometimes I wonder if we should just start over with this process, but you know how cumbersome that might be. From your vantage point, can you talk some specifics in terms of statutory regulatory reform that you'd recommend to give us a fighting chance to have a reasonable time frame for the NEPA review?
I think the first thing we all need to do is just admit the mistakes of the past. We've had some, much of the debate that has happened today, and often happens, and this is, 6th or 7th hearing where I'm a nerd, Mr. Peters is a nerd, Mr. Westerman's a nerd. When they sit around, they talk about permitting. It's not the contextual way, it's a more contextual, and it actually gives you hope in the world that we can cut a deal. But at the end of the day, the problem is that these fights are not about NEPA. Right? They're about other things. They're about tax credits. They're about other things. NEPA is a convenient statute to bring all relevant information to the table and make an informed decision about whether it's go or no go on the project. And the reality is that agencies are dispatching their duties, are supposed to, if the project does not meet certain goals, it kills it. And if not, you have to mitigate against it.
So is that due to legal challenges?
Well, and those are the laws. The problem is most of these laws, the most recent law that was written was 40 years before the internet. We have 13 laws that were not written to coordinate with each other, that are no longer operational for today, yet we still rely on them. And then we have another 65 pieces of regulations that come out of them, another 180 pieces of regulation and precedent, but it's the informal
Mr.
agency
Herrgott, if I'm a
practice.
mining operator, I have no idea how
No
to
idea.
capitalize
If I'm
this
Laurel
stuff.
and I'm at Perpetua doing Midas, Stibnite, or Bogart, I don't know why they got involved in this in the first place. And to tell you what,
So what do we do? I'm listening to you. You're just telling me you're validating my comments, but how do we fix it?
Midas, Stibnite suffered in silence because there was no transparency. They had to hire consultants and do things to get people's ears. And so what?
Maybe I'm not being clear. What do we do to fix it? How do we shorten this thing up?
Complete redesign in a transparent way in which you can't see ghosts and call it out as an override of individual rights or on consultation. The process is broken, and we are not going to be able to make incremental change in this Congress when it's spread across 6 committees of jurisdiction on the House and 5 in the Senate. And then at the end of the day, the people that are going to suffer are going to be these projects, in particular at antimony, which we absolutely need. And we don't have the ability, we don't have the room to wait another 5 years to fight this same battle again. We got to tear it down and build it back up.
You're talking about starting over, basically.
In a rational way together, recognizing that the projects that are impacted the most right at this moment are projects that are backed by the party
Mr.
that does not
Campbell,
want
I've
to
got
do
a
it.
question for you too, and I think that my colleague Congressman Bentz asked a similar question, so I'm not going to restate the entire preface that goes along with that. But are you familiar with the Idaho Power Project, the Boardman to Hemingway transmission line?
I'm sorry, I'm not.
Okay, so there is a project that Idaho Power, a public utility in my state, has been working on. It's a project that's been underway for about 20 years. It's called the Boardman to Hemingway Transmission Line Project. And that has faced multiple federal reviews, state reviews, legal challenges, and not only that, but there's been it's delayed energy benefits to customers, and the growth in our state and in the region is astronomical. And so this has been underway for about 20 years. It's the transmission line project. And so we're about out of time, so just very quickly, changes we need to be making to allow those types of things to get permitted.
Well, I've said this before, I think we need to put bounds on it, that you can only litigate it so long. You need to be involved in the process from the very beginning, and you can't just delay with litigation. And our industry now is at a time that we have to have generation and transmission. Because it used to be gas and oil that's what the energy was. Now it's electricity. Can we provide enough electricity? We don't have time to wait 10 years anymore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm out of time. I do have more questions. I'm going to submit those in writing. Thank you.
Gentlemen's time's expired. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from New Mexico, Ms. Ledger Fernandez, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, basically, the Republican attack on NEPA is part of their larger effort to dictate from D.C. what should be happening locally. They want to dictate from D.C. their desire for more fossil fuel projects, even though the American public wants more renewable energy to meet America's growing energy demands. Their changes to NEPA would destroy community input. Remember, NEPA is indeed a process bill. It encourages and requires coordination with tribes, local communities, scientists, environmentalists, conservations, but also, in my district, farmers and ranchers. Before you undertake projects that could destroy sacred sites, pollute your water, or ruin your farm or a sequia system. And that's the kind of input we want to encourage. As Mr. Mergen just testified, the local community has a lot of great ideas and we want to be able to input them. They enter into negotiations as part of this process. But what Republicans are doing is eliminating that input from the local communities in negotiations. Today's hearing is no different than last night's hearing before the Rules Committee, where Republicans were proposing 3 bills to overturn resource management plans. In Alaska, it was a resource management plan that had been worked out over years through lots of negotiation, right? Years of negotiation and give and take on what should we have in this resource management plan, local input, local negotiations, dictating from DC. The Rules Committee was considering a bill that 7 days after it was introduced, they were going to overturn that resource management plan. Now, that bill isn't going to be heard because Democrats had a motion to require the disclosure of the Epstein files. That would have been heard in Rules, but Republicans are so afraid of voting to release the Epstein files that they canceled the rule. There was no rule issued, and there will not be a vote on those 3 bills this week. Basically, their fear of voting on the Epstein files shut down the Rules Committee and the regular order before this House. That's how afraid they are of the Epstein files. And in some ways, it seems that they are also afraid of community input. So, you know, we've talked a little bit on this committee about how the fact that there has been progress made, you know, response times are about basically in half, but they're understaffing everything. And if you understaff, in New Mexico, in my region, there is nobody to actually review the permits. That's going to put everything back even further. But Mr. Herrgott, I heard you state earlier that this committee should codify the 7 counties' decision to clarify that environmental impact statements should only include proximal impacts and impacts that directly result from a project's activity. So do you agree that greenhouse gas emissions that drive climate change are a direct result of producing and transporting fossil fuels?
I think that NEPA requires that you look at direct and indirect impacts based on what the statutes say, and currently that is not required.
So the question was, do you agree that fossil fuels, the transportation, the development, and the burning of fossil fuels drives climate change? That was the question.
I'm not a scientist to make that determination, but I will tell you it does increase emissions. It reduces emissions on rail, but that's not the substance of making a substantive decision about the science of an emission or the amount of a discharge is for the federal practitioners that are actually pushing the substantive values through the process. What I am talking about is,
So the question was whether fossil fuel development, emission, transportation, and burning addresses climate change. It appears you're trying to not answer the question.
no, it increases CO2 and pollutants. It absolutely does. It does.
It does, right? And so then we should include that in this, and it's not included in this NEPA process.
But that makes a jump
But
to anthropogenic climate change and oscillations in the environment and all sorts of things that are not a direct location of that project. So unless you change the rule about cumulative impacts and global climate emissions.
Well, then we should change the rule because this is something that is impacting everybody, especially if you're in a drought-prone area or where we either have disasters. The last question I wanted
Nobody is
to ask
stopping this
was-
committee from writing
The last question I
laws.
wanted to ask was to Mr. Mergen, was how can the United States be an energy-dominant country if we make it harder to build wind and solar in this country?
We can't.
My time is, I would follow up, but my time has expired, and so I yield back.
Ladies, time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Gray, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have a unique opportunity right now to develop the additional water infrastructure and power projects necessary to increase drought resilience and, frankly, protect California's ag economy. I've been a strong advocate since my arrival here in Washington and on this committee that the federal government needs to stop shirking its responsibility to invest in water infrastructure in the Central Valley in California and throughout the West. But even if we funded every water infrastructure project in the Central Valley today, we would be years away from seeing a final product due to the existing permitting process. These reviews can take anywhere from several months to years for each individual project, causing just absurd delays in approval, let alone initiation of the projects. And while projects that may have larger environmental footprints like Dan's face some of the longest timelines, continued delays increase project costs, especially at a time where uncertainty with the current administration's tariff war and their day-to-day bouncing of the stock market and everything else is already increasing the cost of materials and equipment. And we just saw that with a major project in California, Sites Reservoir, and just an incredible significant increase in the overall cost of, or projected overall cost of the project. We're dealing with all this while project opponents are using the National Environmental Protection Act to slow down these projects through litigation. In fact, studies have shown that due to litigation-related delays, projects can take up to or over 15 years to complete. It's insane, and it's unacceptable. So, Mr. Herrgott, what impacts have litigation had on the NEPA review process? And I think more importantly, and I'm not looking for a 15-year response here, I'm looking to cut to the chase of how do we set some reasonable accountability and timeframes around these projects so that we're both balancing our obligations to roof things, but also delivering projects on budget and on time.
The first step, when I talk about transparency, and it seemed like it's the economy stupid, even in this committee, we're having a question about what the what is, that the CEQ study didn't manipulate statistics to show cherry-pick projects to make it seem like the problem was getting better, not worse, and the fact that we can't track projects in real time, all facets of it, from the cradle to the grave. You do that, then we don't have these rhetorical battles about whose facts are better than others. We actually know what happens on the ground. It's hard to hide behind real facts when you're not just hyperbole, because most of them are hidden. And at the end of the day, yes, we empower stakeholders, yes, we do things, but agencies and CEQA and states, they're not coordinated in a way that they could be. The statutes have gotten overly complicated, and changing them is not a rewrite. Changing them is not a tear down. It is retrofitting them for the day that we live in now and not the one when they were written 70 years ago.
I appreciate that. I'm 47 years old, and the last major reservoir project delivered in California was built about 40 years ago, and it's absurd. We continue to feed the country, 2/3 of the fruits and vegetables out of California, but we got to do better. Based off the existing process and the impacts of litigation, how long would you estimate it would take to build just one water storage infrastructure project in California?
On the due diligence on the front end, which everyone forgets, 3 years, probably 2 years on the application side, and at the end of the day, after ESA and National Marine Fisheries, because they'll both do two separate simultaneous biological opinions, because one's river fish and one is ocean-bearing fish that has a conduit to the sea, and that's under the Department of Commerce. Then you'll bring Bureau of Rec, and then you will bring in tribal consultation with one of the haciendas that'll do 106, that'll establish tribal rights in an attempt to coordinate with the project. At the end of the day, you're anywhere looking for between 5, 15 years or never. I don't think you build a reservoir trying to rebuild Folsom Dam and others. I just don't see a reservoir getting built in any way or shape or form in California for the foreseeable future.
I appreciate it. Our farmers certainly deserve better than waiting decades for these water projects to be built. You know, in my district, I consistently hear about delays from the FERC relicensing process. Hydropower projects are being held up by both state and federal government, imposing fish passages and species protections requirements way beyond the actual effects of the project. I certainly look forward to the attention this is getting and work with my colleagues to passing permitting reform. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. I have a couple of things to ask unanimous consent on. The first is unanimous consent to enter into the record a report from Common Good titled 2 years, not 10 years, redesigning infrastructure approvals, which highlights that a 6-year delay in starting construction on public projects costs the nation over $3.7 trillion. I mentioned that in my opening statement, but I want to put the study in the record without objection, so ordered. Ask unanimous consent to enter into the record this 2021 analysis from the American Action Forum, which states that NEPA imposed a regulatory cost of $229.4 billion across 148 infrastructure projects undergoing review without objection, so ordered. I want to clarify to the witnesses and to the studio audience here and those at home that I have nothing. I consider Mr. Peters a friend. He's been waiting diligently. And it's not a slight against him that he's the last one to get to go, but committee rules require him to wait to the end because he's not on the Resources Committee, and we waived him on for this hearing today. I know this is a subject he cares deeply about, or he wouldn't have been here this long. So I'm going to reward him an extra minute.
Oh, thank you very much.
Mr. Peters, you have 6 minutes. The
Thank you
gentleman
very
from
much.
California, you're
It's-
recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the witnesses. Thanks for allowing me to participate. This is something I care a lot about. And not unlike a lot of these things, I think there's a lot of talking past each other. Let me just start by talking a little bit about what's really happening in China. Today, the current energy mix there is 38% coal, 26% solar, 16% wind, 13% hydro, 3% gas, less than 50% oil and gas. And what they're doing is they are developing now 94 gigawatts of coal. That's true. But 80 gigawatts in 2024 went in of wind, and 227 gigawatts they installed in 2024 of solar, with 720 gigawatts in development. This is a country that's really talking about all of the above, and this is why I'm interested in permit reform. Unfortunately, I should also mention interregional transmission. Since 2014, North America has completed 7 gigawatts of interregional transmission. The comparable number in South America is 22, in Europe 44, and in China 260 gigawatts of interregional transmission. We are not competing against China. And I know, Mr. Campbell, you raised that issue. We need more energy, and I couldn't agree more. We took a big step backwards with the big bill that the Republicans passed, which, because of the loss of the incentives we had in there, could cost us as much as 302 gigawatts of energy. We took a big step backwards. And I know that's the Republicans' right to do it, but I think that's not what we want to do. And the reason I'm interested, and I would say, back talking to Mr. Herrgott, this battle is not over one energy source or another. This is about all energy sources that we need to get permitted. And I'm not speaking today against natural gas. I'm saying we're going to need it all. But it has affected the things I care about as an environmentalist, including public transportation, which gets litigated a lot, including renewable energy, and including forests, which actually, forest projects are the subject of more environmental litigation than anything here. Fortunately, Mr. Westerman and I have a bill to deal with that involves serious reform. I'm very proud of it. Hope it will get passed. But I have to say, to Professor Mergen, I'm not sure I would call you as the witness on whether NEPA is a problem. Because I'm a lawyer. I'm also a government employee. Don't tell these folks we're government employees here. I have nothing against them. But the people I want to hear from, and the people I do hear from, are the people trying to develop clean energy projects, and they complain consistently that permitting is a problem, and that no one suggests that NEPA is the entire problem. I think that's a straw man. We think that NEPA is a big part of the problem, and the reason I think it's vexing for people is because it is purely procedural. It doesn't offer the substantive protection of the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act or the Endangered Species Act. It's a purely procedural thing, and to some extent at least, it is getting in the way. And it's not just the effect of NEPA or the time it takes to prepare a document or the time it takes to litigate that. It's the fear of going in. It's the investors being dissuaded by the risk that's imposed by that process. And this was a problem before DOGE. I mean, I think that there's limitations on the notion that it's the number of employees driving this process. I think there are problems with the process itself. And I think that this was enacted in good faith in 1969, 1970 to deal with those problems. But today, the problem with climate change is we have to act fast, and we are not acting fast. Speed is a problem for us. And unlike in the 70s when we were playing defense, now as climate advocates, we have to play offense. We're trying to build offshore wind. We're trying to build direct air capture. We're trying to build utility scale solar. We're trying to build a lot of stuff to push back on this crisis. We're told it's a 10-year crisis, and we act like it's not a crisis. And I'm talking about this side of the aisle. So I want to get permitting right for those reasons. I would say that Dusty Johnson from South Carolina and I introduced last week an e-permitting bill that we think will provide a lot of, that we think the American Petroleum Institute likes, the Natural Resources Defense Council likes, and provide a central point of input for materials that all the agencies can get at, but also better opportunities for communities to expeditiously participate in a way that's really much more directed, and I think that that's all to the good. I want to say, though, one thing is that the other step back we're taking now is that Republicans have to agree to enforce the law. And Mr. Herrgott, I was really rooting for you. I loved your testimony. But the notion that you could come in here and say that all these permitting issues are a challenge for us and that people are putting their risk capital on the line, and then at the end say, when we hear that the president is messing with issued permits on offshore wind, say that commenting on that is not your job, that really undercuts your credibility. And I think the problem I have with the folks on the other side of the aisle is they want to make a deal with me on permitting reform. I have to have the assurance from them that they're going to have the president, we're all going to have our president, if we want to look at it that way, the president of our party, enforce the deal that we did. And you see exactly the opposite happening here. You see a permit executive order on permitting just for oil and gas. That's not going to bring us together. We see President after all the process saying, well, no, the Secretary of the Interior's got to sign off on individual projects. You know, we were going to have 60,000 to 200,000 energy projects. We were going to have that under the IRA. There is no way that's going to help the process move any faster. And then we thought that the people who supported clean energy on this side of the deal, on the other side of the aisle, as part of the IRA, had reached an agreement, and then we heard there was a side deal with Mr. Norman and the Freedom Caucus. That can't happen. And I'm just saying, let's all agree now that whatever deal we make, and I hope we can make a deal, Mr. Chairman, that we'll all stand behind, that we demand that the executive branch back us up if we make a deal, and I think we can make progress under those circumstances. And I yield back again. Thank you for having me.
Gentlemen's time's expired. There's only one person left to ask questions, and that would be me, so I recognize myself. I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. You know, one thing I can assure you is that there is a need for permitting reform. There's a need because I hear it from people all over the country that come to my office that tell me their hardships and their stories about permitting. It's not just a Republican need. It's not just a House need. It's a bipartisan, bicameral need for permitting reform. And there's a lot of frustration, as we've heard today. And I like to go last in questions because it gives me a chance to listen and to hopefully kind of summarize things. But there's been a lot of fouls called today. And if this hearing had been a year ago with a Democratic administration, there would have been a lot of fouls called on this side of the aisle. Mr. Mergen, you're the legal expert here. So did the Biden administration, were they breaking the law when they kind of picked winners and losers on windmills and solar? And is the Trump administration breaking the law when they're picking winners and losers? And if they are, what's the remedy for that?
That's a complicated question, right? But I will just say that my recommendation, and I think it's the only way that this works, based on a lot of experience litigating NEPA cases, is that any NEPA reform has to apply. It shouldn't pick winners or losers. Does the law allow you to do that? I suppose Congress could enact a law that says we're going to favor fossil or we're going to favor wind.
Is that how the law is being used right now?
I think that the administration, it definitely, right, it seems undeniable that they have put a thumb on the scale against renewable energy.
Did the previous administration put the thumb on the scale? And then we can probably look back at many administrations and see that the thumb has been on the scale. And the thing that I hear is we just want a fair process and a more streamlined process. The courts are weighing in on that now. We saw the court and the Supreme Court in several decisions recently that's telling Congress, you're supposed to make the laws, and that's telling the agencies that NEPA is a process. Those are things that I think hopefully everybody elected to Congress could agree on, that there is separation of powers, and we need to do our job. If we feel like different administrations use the law differently, then it's our responsibility to change it. Mr. Herrgott, I think you called me a nerd earlier, which I embrace that. And I know my wife sometimes calls me tree nerd because I've got a forestry degree, but before I was a forester, I'm an engineer, and I know we got a couple of engineers here. And I've actually done permits before for projects, and they weren't even the NEPA process, but I can tell you they were extremely frustrating. And if you're going through these permitting processes, you look at the permit application and you think, about 10% of this is actually useful and is going to protect the environment, and the rest of it is checking the box. And a lot of times it costs a lot of money to check the box. And I'm not even talking about a NEPA with a process like this behind me, just a simple clean air permit or clean water permit or water discharge permit. So I want to ask the engineers at the table, is it possible to streamline permitting and still meet all the environmental objectives and maybe even exceed those objectives and build your project? You can, both of y'all. If you're an engineer, you can speak up.
I'm an engineer, and I do think you can. In fact, there's no question in my mind you can, and I think we have to do that. And I thought your comment on putting your finger on the scale on either side is a real problem. We're starving for predictability in my industry. We're trying to make 35-year decisions, and we have 4-year energy policy in our country. And that is really hurting all of us. We need something, and NEPA is a part of it, to give us predictability. Tell us what you want us to do, and then we'll live within that. But now it just changes back and forth. And that's why I believe and have promoted that every energy policy should be treated the same. We shouldn't favor one or favor the other. Let's just look at the environmental impacts on that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Boals?
Engineers like structure and consistency. And if you have a process that is fair and evaluates all things just like we would in any type of design or, as you say, answering the questions on a permit that we submit, I think that those objectives can be achieved through just a little bit more structure.
I'm all for a little bit more structure and creativity in the way we accomplish our objectives here. I'm out of time. You're yielding me another minute, Mr. Peters. Well, I would also say that we could probably put 40 different people at the witness table and do this hearing all week long nonstop, and we would hear how big of a deal NEPA really is and how the permitting process is. And my goal is that we create a process that actually works to protect the environment, that actually works with a blindfold on to allow people access to the process to get their projects permitted. And we've seen on both sides of the aisle, I mean, think about the CHIPS Act. This was a bipartisan bill. I didn't vote for it, still a bipartisan bill, to build chip processing plants in the United States so we could compete globally with countries like China. Just because of the federal nexus with money, these manufacturing plants on private land had to go through the NEPA process. Now, that doesn't seem like a really common sense thing to do. We also saw the IJA, the infrastructure bill, put more money out there for infrastructure projects than it costs to build the entire interstate highway system in today's dollars. And what do we have to show for that? We got some things, but we could have had a lot more to show for that. So the objective of this hearing, I think, has been met, that we heard from frustration from both sides of the aisle. I appreciate the witness's testimony, and I'm going to give each witness a minute to say anything else you think we need to hear that you might not have gotten asked in about 4 hours of sitting there. We'll start with Mr. Boals.
I'm not sure what else to add that we haven't covered, because we've covered from A to Z and back again and back down again. So I don't know. I just appreciate your time and the committee's time in inviting us here to discuss this.
Mr. Campbell.
For me, very briefly, I thought it's been rewarding to sit here and listen to the conversation today, even though there's divisiveness. Some people are on one side, some are on the other. I felt that everybody wants to solve the problem, and this is a solvable problem. And it'll be good for all of the people in America. The people at the end of our lines will benefit from that. Thank you.
Mr. Mergen.
I want to thank you for having me. What I greatly appreciated hearing from the members and my fellow witnesses. And what I heard from them is that we need stability in this process. And I think that is undeniable. And I really strongly support a stable process, which we don't have right now. And I would just strongly counsel this very serious endeavor that you're undertaking to remember average Americans, the interests of all Americans and their ability to participate in this process in a meaningful way. We can talk about how complicated that process is or what's robust, but it seems really important when I worked in Wyoming that the people in Wyoming were heard, right? The ranchers and the farmers. And it was also important that people who cared about Yellowstone or Grand Teton and the greater Yellowstone ecosystem had a voice. And so we need to focus on reforms that keep the public engaged. And I think the litigation problems are on the way to being solved. And I would just stress that as well.
And I would agree with you on having public input. I don't think we need to do away with that either. Mr. Herrgott?
I think, I worked for the late Senator Inhofe for about 12 years, and his best friend was Bernie Sanders and boxer. And although I stood behind him while he threw a snowball on the Senate floor, at the same time, he walked over and they cut deals on some of the largest infrastructure bills in the history of our country, safety loop, that had very low chance of making it over the finish line, and were the model for IIJ and others. I think it's important, and to Mr. Peters, to your question about offshore wind, I think it's extremely important that we eject the decisions about energy choices and much like on cost allocation or FERC 1000 on transmission, there is the process that is the process that is the process. Then there is the business case for energy source and the situations there within. If we continue to allow that discussion and the overarching political discussion distract us from doing the bread and butter of what we know, which is getting to a decision in a reasonable amount of time with the right consultation and all of the things that are required, because at the end of the day, in 2014, President Obama on the State of the Union, natural gas, I'll knock down the red tape and I'll build it on my own if I have to. He's talking about natural gas, and 4 years later, we're talking about something else. And so the politics, I'm not naive enough to think the politics aren't going to change, and there's realities there within. But on this issue, if we can inoculate and go in a room and take the other stuff out, if you don't fix the process now, it was a shame that there was not one single piece of permitting in the IRA bill, all the money, none of the ability to get there. FRA, statutory changes, none of the ability to enforce it on the Senate, or at least from the congressional standpoint. The ability to, we can complain all we want, but at the end of the day, the Congress hasn't legislated on permitting in a very long time, and when we leave it to other people, we have no one to complain about but ourselves, and confession is good for the soul after a long time in the Senate, writing press releases on permitting bills that I thought did things that didn't at all. And now that in the trenches, I earnestly think that if we can come together, we can fix some problems.
Thank you, and I would add to that I like your idea of separating the permitting process from the business process. Let permitting be blind to the technology and the project, and let investors and the economy pick the winners and losers as to what should be built. I think we would all be better off if we could go down that road. Just to show how much support there is for doing something on the permitting process, I ask unanimous consent to submit for the record letters from the following organizations in support of NEPA and permitting reform this Congress. These groups include the American Conservation Coalition Action, Western Energy Alliance, the Energy Workforce and Technology Council, the U.S. Oil and Gas Association, the International Association of Drilling Contractors, the Independent Petroleum Association of America, the Bipartisan Policy Center, the Gulf Energy Alliance, the National Ocean Industries Association, Texas Alliance of Energy Producers, the California Agricultural Commissioners and Sealers Association, the Institute for Progress, Turn Forward, Signal Peak Energy, Clear Path Action, Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions, the Center of the American Experiment, the National Mining Association, the Consumer Energy Alliance, Securing America's Future, or Future Energy, or SAFE, Fervo Energy, Geothermal Rising, the Women's Mining Coalition, R Street Institute, American Clean Power, Micron, and a lot of others that didn't send a letter without objection. So ordered.
Thank you.
Well, you're recognized.
Mr. Chair, I ask unanimous consent to enter the record 2 letters urging extreme caution in permitting reform and advocating for thoughtful conversations, community-centered project planning from the Western Environmental Law Center and 26 grassroots environmental and tribal organizations. And also ask unanimous consent to enter into the record, record this letter for the record from many organizations, including Earth Justice, League of Conservation Voters, Sierra Club, Great Old Broads for Wilderness, Southern Environmental Law Center, Union of Concerned Scientists, and We Act for Environmental Justice.
Without objection, so ordered. And I thank the witnesses for your valuable testimony. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for you, and we will ask you to respond to those in writing. Under Committee Rule 3, members of the committee must submit questions to the committee clerk by 5 p.m. on Friday, July 25th. The hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there's no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.